Night Shift Witch by Kate Lawley. Narrated by April Doty. Copyright 2017, Catherine G. Cobb. Production copyright 2021, Catherine G. Cobb. Chapter 1. One step closer to financial freedom, 2 steps closer to dead people. Austin, Texas, 1999. I shifted in the hard chair and couldn't help but pity the poor bereaved souls who usually sat in them. I would have thought a funeral home would spring for more comfortable chairs, especially given the cost of services. Appalling, really. With those prices, I'd have to start saving now, and I wasn't even edging close to 30 yet. The man sitting across from me frowned and said, "I've been meaning to get new chairs. My assistant, a former assistant, was going to take care of it before she retired, but time got away from her." I stopped fidgeting and met the gaze of the too young funeral director. He was almost cute, in a red-headed, quiet, laid-back kind of way. Not my usual dark and brooding type. Not my type at all. It was hard for me to look people in the eye these days, but I sucked it up and made myself. I wanted this job, and only sketchy people avoided eye contact. That's probably a good idea. So, about those hours. Would that work for you? He leaned forward and made a note on the legal pad in front of him. Like the ad said, any time between 7 p.m. and 7 a.m. 7 to midnight isn't a problem. So, he looked up from his scribbling, and his blue eyes drilled into mine. When can you start? My breath caught. There was something there. Something that made my heart clench in my chest. Good? Bad? I didn't know. I blinked, breaking the connection, unwilling to see some secret truth buried deep inside a man I'd met 10 minutes ago. Mastering magical sight was turning out to be tricky. Since I'd begun studying it, I'd had a few accidental, uncomfortable moments, but this was the worst so far. I had to figure out how to turn it all the way off, or never look anyone in the eye again. I didn't want to know the hidden truths of every passing stranger. Sometimes the advantages of being a witch paled in comparison to the excess baggage one picked up along the way. But then I realized that in the midst of avoiding this man's inner truths, I'd almost missed a very important fact. He just offered me a job. I tamped down a surge of excitement and squeaked out an overeager, "Tonight?" I took a breath and said in a much more normal person sort of tone, "I mean, thank you for the job, and I can start as soon as tonight." Miracle of miracles. My dyed black hair, pale skin, and dark clothes hadn't nixed my chances of gainful employment. A little surprising this far out in the boonies. Buda, Texas, wasn't exactly Austin. Then again, maybe my not-quite-goth look did bother my new boss, and there just weren't that many people willing to handle bodies for minimum wage. Outside of the fact that I thought preparing the dead for their next phase of life was kind of cool, I also needed the cash and the flexible hours that this job offered. And my witchy background helped me see dead bodies in a more neutral light than the regular non-magical folk. Now was probably the time to bring up the awkward question of dress codes and such, but I didn't want to give this Kowalski guy any reason to change his mind. "I'll be doing your orientation and training over this week, so let's start from 7 to 10. If everything goes well, I'll get you a key and you can lock up at night when you're done." He rose to his feet and extended his hand. "Welcome to Kowalski Funeral Home, Stephanie." My skin itched with unease at the thought of skin-to-skin contact, but if I was going to work with regular, unenhanced humans, I was going to have to get used to some contact. And the name. I didn't go by Stephanie anymore, but Star didn't seem like a name that would win over many employers, so I put my birth name on all my applications. I swallowed a sigh and stuck out my hand. I really should have worn gloves. A brief look of amusement passed over his face as he shook my hand. Maybe my reluctance had shown. Oops. His hand enveloped mine. He was a big guy, and I was a midget, but it still surprised me. He briskly shook my hand and released it. And the second shocker? I didn't get anything from him. No emotions, no vibes, no energy. I also didn't get that creepy sensation of having my personal bubble invaded. Weird. Could this guy actually be good old-fashioned nice? The genuine bland variety that meant he wasn't picturing me naked or lying to me or trying to take advantage of me? Was it possible that he was basically feeling and thinking nothing bad? Nothing that leaked out through skin-to-skin contact and made me feel like I've touched something dark and slimy? Whoa. That really was a first. It felt like just about everyone I touched these days had some dark, deep, hidden nasty just waiting to be revealed to the light of day. Touching people had become exhausting. This Kowalski guy was a pleasant change. I'm looking forward to working here, Mr. Kowalski. And I was only a little annoyed that I meant it. Dead people didn't creep me out, and I was in need of a little cash, but mostly I liked the vibe of the place, and the guy. And since this guy's job, all day long, was to deal with grief-stricken people, maybe he was actually as nice as he appeared. Call me Ben, please. You can save the formalities for the clients. He hesitated briefly, then added, not that you'll be interacting with the clients. Aha! I knew he couldn't be that perfect. I smiled, striving for an innocent expression. Oh no, you wouldn't want the clients to meet the night shift. His lips twitched as his gaze dipped to the rips in the knees and thighs of my jeans where my black tights peeked through. If you don't mind wearing dark slacks and a white button-down shirt, I'd be happy to have you assist with late services. We can always use the help. After delivering that zinger, he walked around his desk and motioned to the office door. Not only had he called my bluff, the guy didn't leak an ounce of deception. The invitation was genuine. My lip ring, black hair, and pale skin were apparently welcome, and not just in the back with the dearly departed. I could understand having to ditch the ratty jeans and tights. I walked to the door, confused. No one was as cool as this man seemed to be, and especially not someone wearing a dark gray suit, the blandest tie imaginable, and a practically military haircut. He escorted me through the back to a service exit. I'll give you a call if I have any questions about your paperwork. Otherwise, I'll see you tomorrow night at 7. I nodded, since I didn't know what else to say, and I walked to my old Civic with a smile on my face. Next stop, my mentor Camille's house. I needed a debrief and a glass of wine, or 3. The interview, the evening as a whole, had been unsettling, and there was only my mom waiting at home. Since I'd moved out of my ex's place, I'd been living with her. She was the last person I could talk to about what just happened in my interview, or anything else that hinted at witch business. She didn't know magic was real, and hadn't the faintest idea her only daughter was a witch. She would not approve. Mom thought the Society for the Study of Paranormal and Occult Phenomena was just a bunch of nuts out hunting ghosts. A glorified ghost hunting club. I could hardly tell her they were actually the governing body for the local paranormal crowd. She'd think I'd lost my bananas. And if she didn't think I needed immediate psychiatric care, well, that would be so much worse. The society kept local magic on the down low. They had a sort of hide-or-die attitude that they were slowly growing out of. It hadn't been that long ago that the villagers had chased magically enhanced people, like vampires and witches, with pitchforks. So, no sharing my witchy woes with Mom. Not unless I wanted the Society's designated memory wipers to slice those memories out of her brain. The Society wasn't exactly modern in its view of civil liberties, and not all of the memory wiper witches were as handy at their trade as they should be. I rubbed my forehead. A low-level throb was pulsing behind my eyes. Slicing and dicing, even of the magical variety, shouldn't be anywhere near my mom's mind. The woman was annoying, but she didn't deserve that. Speaking of being annoying, she was totally going to freak out when I told her about this job. For so many reasons, and only one of them had to do with me handling dead bodies. I shook my head as I navigated the long drive of the funeral home. Mom was hopeless. Camille kept telling me to give her a break, but she didn't have to live with a woman. Thank goodness for Ben Kowalski. The extra income from this job should have me out of my mom's place and into my own apartment in just a few weeks. Mom would be out of my hair, and I'd be far enough away that I might be able to avoid exposing her to magic and the slice and dice of her dear, but much too maternal, brain. Chapter 2. Epic Fail, Witch Style. As I pulled into Camille's driveway 20 minutes later, I had the same thought I had every time I drove through her neighborhood. Welcome to suburbia. But Camille's hood wasn't just some suburb with a bunch of commuters and an HOA. Her neighbors were seriously committed to the lifestyle. Minivans, immaculate lawns, carefully trimmed hedges, and everyone in everyone else's business. My mom would love it. Camille's neighbors, nosy though they might be, lived in blissful ignorance of her true nature. Bad enough she was a hippie with a delinquent friend who visited all too frequently. That would be me. But if they found out she was a practicing witch, the horror. I swallowed a chuckle as I parked next to Camille's silver Jetta. In the short time it took me to exit my car and spot old Mrs. Feathers across the street peering through her window, Camille had beaten me to the front door. She was waiting with a glass of red wine and a grin. "You look like you need it." "Are you sure you're not psychic?" I accepted the glass gratefully and took a sip as soon as her front door closed behind us. Lovely. Waving me into the living room, she said, "It doesn't take a psychic to predict you need a drink after a job interview. What was this, your fifth?" "Fifth and final." I shot her big fluffy gray cat Twinkles a warning look as I sank into the sofa as far from him as possible. "I got the job." She clinked her glass against mine before sitting in the armchair nearest me. "Congratulations. Here's to being one step closer to your own apartment. Which one did you land? The pizza delivery gig or the cleaning job?" "Neither, thank goodness. The funeral home." Camille tipped her head and examined me. "Really? I'd have thought your angst-filled look would have been a bit much for a funeral home." "I don't look angst-filled. I wasn't sure exactly. Mostly I was going for not like myself." I pointed a finger at her and said, "Artistic. I look artistic. Besides, I'm working in the back, cleaning, doing makeup and clothes, and handling some basic paperwork." She eyed my black ripped jeans, tights, and t-shirt. "Your co-workers still have to look at you. You could wear something beside black for a change. It's depressing, and no one working in a funeral home needs more depressing in their life." She leaned forward and tugged a lock of my hair, probably the silver streak right in the front. "And how about letting your poor hair recover from all that bleaching and dyeing?" We'd had this conversation before. Camille was 5'7" and had thick, gorgeous dark brown hair. She just didn't get it. "You try being 5'2" and blonde for a day. See if anyone takes you seriously." Twinkles made a sound that was suspiciously dismissive. That cat did not like me. "I know you don't want to hear it, but I think you'd be surprised. You're not 15 anymore." She held up a hand when I scowled at her. "Just think about it." 15 was when we'd met. when she'd seen a hint of the witch that I might become and taken me under her wing. I'd been about a year into my experimental, not quite goth look. For the first time in my life, I'd felt seen, and not in a way that diminished me. I felt strong and independent, not cheek-pinching adorable. I didn't want to lose the strength I'd found by altering my appearance. So what if my reasons were fear-based? Who wanted to feel small and insignificant? Not me. I scowled harder. Camille tucked her hair behind her ear. Well, if you're going to be that way, I'll go ahead and point out you're only 5'2" in your dreams, or in heels. Ouch. She got me there. And Twinkles was smirking. I glared at him. If you're done maligning my wardrobe and crushing my dreams of becoming a runway model, can we do some training? I followed my request with a taste of the wine she'd offered me. Since you refuse to fire me as your mentor, we probably should. She took another sip of her wine, but I could still see the grin behind the glass. Nah, let's take the night off. Tonight we're celebrating. Camille was proud to have me as her mentee. A few other witches had tried to poach me, and I'd stood firm. I was what they called a talent. After my transformation in my late teens, my powers had blossomed, and I'd far outpaced Camille in sheer witch wattage. But even if Camille wasn't the most powerful of witches, she was mine, and I wasn't letting her go. She still had more skill and knowledge than I could hope to gain in several years of study, but more importantly, she was kind and understood me. Ugh, I wasn't usually so sentimental. First my teen witch beginnings, and then getting all maudlin over Camille's role in my life. Please, dwelling in the past wasn't like me at all. We need to work on my magical sight. I had another one of those incidents. I thought back on the fleeting moment of eye contact I'd had with my boss, Kowalski. Ben. Not sure how I felt about him. Actually, I was sure. I just wasn't sure I trusted how I felt about him. Was he the nice guy he seemed to be, or just a bunch of false advertising? I guess I'd find out in the coming weeks, assuming he didn't fire me. I sipped the excellent wine Camille had provided. Someday, I too might afford better than Target's boxed variety. I had lofty goals, but my own apartment was the first step. When you say incident, Camille asked, do you mean like you had with your ex? When you almost looked inside his head? I agreed that it was exactly like when I'd almost accidentally looked inside his head. It was one thing to peek inside someone's brain. Not fun, but a skill that witches could and should develop. If there was ever a legitimate need for me to do it, I needed to do it right, with as much precision as possible. It was something else altogether to peek inside someone's head without an invitation. Morally questionable, certainly. Someday I hoped it would be illegal. But to have a peek unintentionally, that reeked of utter incompetence. I didn't want to be that incompetent twit star who never lived up to her potential. Also, who wanted to see inside Alex Valois' head? That had to be a dark place. Hard pass for me, thank you. These little flashes of connection that you've been experiencing aren't incidents. They're opportunities. It might be invasive, but you should take the chance to practice when it presents itself. Besides, the universe might be speaking to you and trying to tell you something. Camille and I obviously had very different ideas about witch sight. Hers were the more mainstream view. I snorted. Do you really think I need to know Alex Valois' innermost thoughts? Or that I need to know Ben Kowalski's deep, dark secrets? I can't imagine he even has any. Oh, I snapped my fingers. He shook my hand and I didn't get any creepy vibes. I was taking that as evidence that he might be a nice guy. But again, the jury was still out. It did prove that he was at least not the kind of guy who had obscene, violent, or otherwise unsavory thoughts within moments of meeting me. It was shocking how small the number of people were that I could include in that group. Witches tended to bring out the worst in people, I was fairly sure. Camille and I had talked about it before. It was that, or there were a lot of icky people out there. Third alternative? The icky ones made a point of ensuring they made some sort of skin-to-skin contact. Yuck. Camille eyed me with curiosity. Understandably. It was always a pleasant surprise to not have a bad experience when touching an unenhanced person. "You're sure he hasn't got any magic?" Which was a legitimate question, because if he had magic, he'd be able to shield his intentions. Also, I should have checked. I didn't. My chipped black nail polish suddenly became utterly fascinating. "You didn't check?" And that was Camille's mom tone. Wow, did I need a manicure. I picked at the edges of my polish on my thumbnail. "Star, what were you thinking?" I looked up at the concern in her voice. She wasn't chiding me, just really worried. "You've got to check first thing." I nodded, and she continued. "If this guy, Ben, if he has some latent talent, you can't work with him. He might pick up on some magical spark. Or worse, what if he's enhanced and just not registered with the society? That's twice as bad, because that means he's probably shady." I winced. Because yeah, I get it. I flubbed. Honestly, I was just super shocked he didn't send me packing right away. You should have seen this guy, Camille. Bland suit, bland tie, precise haircut. Is he cute? Huh? I heard her just fine, but I wanted a second to consider my response. At the time, I just thought he wasn't my type, but then my type hadn't been working out so well for me. But no, he was all human all the way. Or at least I thought he was. I'd be confirming tomorrow. And Ben Kowalski was not the sort of guy to react well to the whole magic is real situation, even if there wasn't a logistical issue with the society. "Attractive, Star. Did the man make your girly parts take notice?" I frowned at her. "I'll check first thing when I meet him tomorrow, about whether he has magic or not. My girly parts are a non-issue. The man's my boss, and like I said, the uptight sort." Although, was he? His hair was uptight, but was the man? "I'll even gaze into bland Ben's innermost self and tell you what I see," I said, in an attempt to head her off when it looked like she was going to pursue the attractiveness angle, and then immediately felt bad for calling him bland. He seemed nice. Nice wasn't bland. Nice was nice. The handshake could have been a fluke, but I suspected not. And just because he wore a bland tie, well, if I was being fair, it was probably a requirement of the job. Grieving people probably weren't into groovy or creative ties. They probably wanted the person who was responsible for handling their loved one's remains to wear the most boring tie in existence, to look as respectable as possible, to blend into the dang wallpaper. "You thinking about bland, Ben?" Camille said, with a secretive little smile. I rolled my eyes. "I'm thinking about having a look inside my boss's head, and how potentially awkward that could make my entire work experience. I'm sacrificing my future comfort in my workspace just for you." Not really. I was actually curious what I'd find when I had a peek inside his head, and if my mentor said it was a good idea, then I'd put aside my moral objections for the purposes of learning. Just this once. She chuckled. "If you find out he's a secret cat lover, I'm gonna be laughing so hard I'm crying." I glanced at Twinkles. He met my gaze, then deliberately lifted his hind leg and proceeded to clean his balls. You really should get that cat neutered, Camille. Twinkles stopped his grooming just long enough to growl at me. While Camille chuckled at our antics, I thought about the fact that I'd have to quit my newfound job if Ben turned out to have some latent magical talent, and also considered the promise I'd made Camille. I'd give my unpredictable sight a quick opportunity. One look into Ben's eyes, and if I connected, I'd have a look. But that probably wouldn't happen. Pretty sure what happened today had just been a glitch. Chapter 3. Lessons Learned from Twinkles the Cat. After I'd finished a glass and a half of wine, Camille announced, "I've changed my mind." "You're firing me as a mentee?" I replied, stretching my legs out on the sofa. Twinkles and I had reached a temporary truce, but I still kept my sock-clad toes well away from him. "You've decided to move to France. No more witch training for me," I mock-mourned. Twinkles thought that was just dandy, and he actually lifted his head from my leg long enough to smirk in my direction. "France sounds nice, but no. I doubt Twinkles would enjoy the plane ride, and the only French I know would get me arrested." Twinkles had just settled back into a restful pose when Camille said, "No, I've changed my mind about training this evening. You're going to have a look inside Twinkles's head." That caught his attention. Mine, too. I wouldn't exactly put my lack of desire to see inside Twinkles's mind on a par with the twinge of horror I had at getting a glimpse inside Alex's, but it was close. Twinkles and I coexisted. We did not enjoy one another's company. Camille was well aware of the nature of our relationship, that we tolerated each other only because of our shared affection for her. Bad plan. I eyed the evil beastie with a cute exterior. For once, I was fairly sure that Twinkles's smirk was indicative of agreement. "It's perfect." She waved a hand dismissively. "I know you both pretend not to like each other, but that's irrelevant. Twinkles is a perfect subject. He's more open than a human, so you'll have less natural resistance. He's a cat." I felt ridiculous pointing out the obvious, but so far as I knew, witch sight only worked on humans. Born or made, enhanced or not, didn't matter. But human. A cat with an intimate, magical connection to a witch. You know what happens when cats, pets of any kind, live with us for any period of time. She stood up with a cheerful smile. "Come on now. It'll be fun." Twinkles and I shared a look, and again I felt that we were in agreement. Neither of us thought much of Camille's plan. But we went along. When it came down to the wire, I trusted Camille. Why Twinkles agreed? Maybe I'd find out. Camille planted me on a footstool across from the fluffy fiend and told me to open my mind and look. I looked. Twinkles, still lounging on one end of the sofa, licked his paw and cleaned his face. At least he wasn't focusing on his nether region. That would have been even more distracting. Regardless, I got nothing. Open your mind, your magic. You have to look with more than your eyes. I tried. Sort of. Camille sat next to Twinkles and rubbed his jaw. He purred happily, but I'd swear he was eyeing me from the corner of those big green eyes of his. "What do you think you'll see?" Camille asked. In Twinkles's head? A plan to rule the universe, minimally." Twinkles purred louder, and I rolled my eyes. "Kidding, you furry freak." This time he actually turned his head to give me the evil eye. "Be serious." Camille's voice was firm. She was losing patience with the two of us. Actually, as special as he might be, Twinkles was still basically a cat, so I'm sure her annoyance was aimed mostly at me. Okay, in all seriousness, I suspect he's concerned primarily with the cat basics. A soft bed, sunbathing, food, chasing flies, and petting. He made a huffing noise when I mentioned chasing flies. Fair enough. Correction. A soft bed, sunbathing, food, hunting flies and other insects, and petting. The great and mighty Twinkles didn't deign to acknowledge my concession, but he also didn't make any more disgruntled noises. That sounds about right, Camille agreed. Any of that seem frightening? I scowled, because her implication was clear. I was blocked in using my sight because I was fearful of what I'd see. I scowled even harder when I realized she was likely right. People kind of sucked. Skin-to-skin contact over the years since I'd become a witch had proven that. Much as I loved having an intuitive mentor who understood me, it could also be a serious downer when she pushed me in ways I found uncomfortable, like now. So, she said softly, are you ready to try again? I caught Twinkles' bright green gaze, and I looked, truly looked. And with my eyes and magic open, I saw. Not surprisingly, I received confirmation that Twinkles was indeed a maniacal fiend. He was consumed by a lust for the perfect meal, followed closely by a desire to discover and exploit the perfect postprandial reclining spot, one that would ideally be secluded, soft, and bathed by the gentle rays of the afternoon sunlight. Less anticipated was his bent toward romanticizing his own needs and desires. I contained my mental eye roll in case I'd lose the connection, and continued to observe. His only other concerns were the avoidance of all things resembling work, and too much compliance with his human companion's desires. Bad cat. But again, not surprising. As much affection as Camille had for him, hers was not a blind love. She was well aware her cat had a less than twinkling personality. When I'd trawled around enough to be comfortable that I hadn't missed anything that I desired to know, I left. I intentionally left certain parts of Twinkles' mind and his memories unexplored. For example, my existence within his head I treated as radioactive and avoided entirely. Our gazes magically unentangled, Twinkles stood, presented his butt to me, and sauntered away. That cat, I muttered. Camille laughed. I'm under no illusions as to Twinkles' true nature, but he's good company. She paused, then amended her statement. He can be good company when he chooses, and he keeps my feet warm at night. As long as you're happy. Because I wasn't touching her love and affection for that furry freak with anything that looked like criticism. She arched an eyebrow. The woman knew me too well. Question. Yes? I knew I was about to receive the true takeaway from this lesson. It hadn't been just about practicing the mechanics of using my sight. Were you bothered by Twinkles' thoughts and feelings, or did you navigate through the experience? Obviously, she knew the answer. I walked through what I wanted to see, avoiding what I didn't. But I don't think humans are quite that simple. No, she agreed, but you can do it. Armed with my experience from the previous evening, I showed up at Kowalski's funeral home the next morning ready to be trained for the job, but also ready to have a peek inside Ben Kowalski's head should the opportunity present itself. At 6:57 p.m., I parked around the backside of the funeral home and headed for the service entrance. I didn't have a key yet, but that wasn't a problem, because Ben opened up the back door as soon as I knocked. Once the door had closed behind us, I did the deed. First, I checked that he wasn't hiding some latent magical talent, because I wasn't lacking in all sense. But then I did the deed. As he reached out his hand in greeting, I took it and met his gaze. I let myself fall, metaphorically, and unlike with Twinkles, where I floated for an instant, gathered my intel, blinked, and then retreated, with Ben, I landed. I'd miscalculated by adding touch to the equation. Mental note to unpack that decision and its consequences some other time. For now, I was too busy. Sitting by a fire with my hands around a mug of peppermint hot chocolate. Cocooned in a quilt on a snowy Christmas day. Lying in bed, a down comforter tucked around me with the sound of rain falling on the roof. Feeling my grandfather's arms holding me close. Feeling like all the love in the world surrounded me. I dropped Ben's hand and stepped back, looking anywhere but at the tall redhead in front of me. Ben was love and warmth and comfort, and I sort of wanted to cry right now. I tried to catch my breath, and I thought about unsentimental things, unloving things. Twinkles. Twinkles was perfect. I thought about that furry fiend, and the looming tears receded. Maybe Ben, who was most definitely not bland, hadn't felt any of that. I could only hope. "What was that?" Ben asked. No such luck. Looked like I hadn't been the only one to feel our intense connection. Also, I was going to kick Camille in the shin next time I saw her. "Navigate the experience," she'd said. Yeah, right. There was no navigating that rush of emotion. I gave Ben a confused look and shook my head. I tried to speak, hoping some glib explanation would magically fall from my lips, but there was a lump lodged in my throat. I swallowed with some difficulty and walked further into the room. So that was one question answered. That breath-catching moment of eye contact I'd had with my boss the day before? Not a glitch. Ben cleared his throat, and I realized we weren't alone in the room. He pointed me to a sheet-covered body. "I thought you could assist with Mr. Chalmers' makeup. I don't have real talent for it, but since our previous makeup artist retired, I've been handling it." I nodded. We'd discussed this in the interview. He was hopeful I'd be able to take over this particular task once I'd had some training, but also got the impression that if I didn't, I wouldn't lose my job. Just one more indication that Ben Kowalski was good people. As if my peek into his head hadn't been enough of a clue. He pulled the sheet back. "May I introduce Mr. Chalmers, age 32, killed in a car accident." He eyed me warily as I got my first glimpse of Mr. Chalmers. Probably for signs I was going to pass out or puke. Not likely. But, uh-oh. No way Mr. Chalmers was 32. And he sure as heck hadn't died in a car accident. What were the chances? My first dead body, and I'd stumbled onto an enhanced human. That was one in a lot. I flipped the sheet back below his groin, certain I was mistaken. But no mistake. There were his creation tattoos, plain as day. I was looking at a very dead golem. That was bad news. Golems were hard to kill. I leaned closer and inspected his tats. There were very small cuts along several of them. This wasn't garden variety bad. No. This was the murdered variety bad. Murder? Just peachy. How is that going to go down? A golem in a non-magical funeral home that had been murdered. Body dump came to mind, because golems shouldn't end up in normal, everyday human funeral homes. I stepped back from the body. "I need to call my boyfriend. My ex. I pressed my lips together and took a breath, then looked up into Ben's very confused face. He should be confused. I hadn't been bothered by my supposed first body. Had in fact stripped the sheet off him and examined the man's junk, or near enough that it'd likely look like I was. "Sure," he spoke slowly, as if addressing a small child, or a lunatic. You can use the phone in the office. It's just around the corner. Someday, I'd have to break down and spring for a mobile phone. After I moved into my own apartment. I hurried to Ben's office and dialed Alex's number. While Alex and I might no longer be an item, and he drove me nuts on a personal level, I trusted him. Besides, this was his job. He was a society enforcer. Hello? How a man could sound pissed off in just one word, I didn't know, but Alex managed it. Alex, it's Star. I've got a problem. I just started working at a funeral home. What? What in the world possessed you? And now he'd gone from generally pissed to specifically pissed. He didn't understand why I wouldn't work for the society or pimp out my witch skills. The concept of witch in training eluded him. We were not getting into that right now. Shut it. I don't have much time. I'm on the funeral home phone. I needed a part-time job after I moved out of your place. So, here I am. I inhaled, and then, as quick as I could, said, A golem showed up with his creation tattoos damaged. Robert Chalmers is the name we have for him. After a moment of silence, he said, I'm heading out the door now. Kowalski's right. Give me directions so I don't have to look it up. Stop. Panic hit me. Alex was going to get me fired. You cannot show up here and ruin this for me. I need this job. He grumbled, because that was what Alex did. And no, he wasn't all bark and no bite. Alex could back up his grumbles with fighting skills and magic, because he had an abundance of both. Despite all that, he had a heart of gold. I would never have dated such a grump if he didn't. I cut him off. Stop complaining and tell me how to secure the body temporarily. When my boss leaves for the night, I'll call you, and you could come then to help me. If you even think about arguing with me, I will make your life a misery. I looked up when I finished my rant to find Ben in the doorway. And I'd forgotten to magically seal the room. He'd heard every word. Chapter 4. Beyond Epic Fail. Or, could this day get worse? How could I be so colossally careless? Preventing exposure of magic wasn't my top priority as a witch, but it was close. Ben crossed his arms and moved to block the office door. And I'd thought Alex was the problem. I just lost my job all on my own. I hadn't even made it a day. I closed my eyes and listened to Alex's terse instructions, then hung up the phone. I opened my eyes, hoping my wild imagination had conjured Ben earlier. No such luck. He was very real, and very much standing between me and the only exit. So, thanks for letting me use the phone. It was a weak attempt at damage control. Pretend like nothing happened, and bluff my way to a resolution. So you can plan a break-in of my business? Sure. You know, we don't keep cash here. I frowned at him. You think I want to steal from you? That he believed me capable of that hurt my feelings. Insane? Yes, especially since I might be stealing from him. A body, not cash, but still. What's a golem? His arms were still crossed, and he didn't look like he was budging. That answered one question. He'd heard the entire conversation. Maybe this job had been a terrible idea. Maybe Alex was right, and I should stick with shady society gigs for extra cash. I hated that he might be right. The idea that pimping my magic out to the society was my only real option was more disheartening than losing a job after less than 5 minutes of employment. But I had a here-and-now problem to solve. My future cash flow issues were a tomorrow problem. I went with an old standard. That wasn't what it sounded like. So you're not planning to rob me or saying Mr. Chalmers is a golem, whatever that is. His eyes narrowed. "Is that some type of gang?" He narrowed his eyes. "Are you in a gang?" "You don't look like a gang member." I shook off the feeling of being examined like a bug under a magnifying glass and tried to think of some way to salvage the situation. "You seem like a really nice guy." In fact, I knew he was a really nice guy. Incredibly, amazingly nice. He uncrossed his arms, but remained firmly planted in front of the door. "I am, but nice doesn't mean gullible." I sighed. The idea of sticking it to the man appealed, even when the man in question was a scary secret society. So I broke some society laws and spilled the beans. Mr. Chalmers is a golem, and it's not a gang. How's your Jewish folklore? Good enough to know that if golems were real, which they clearly aren't, the man on my prep table couldn't be one because he's not made of clay. No, not clay. Scavenged corpse parts. Ben choked. "I'm sorry. What? You're telling me that the man on my prep table is some kind of Frankenstein creature made of miscellaneous parts? A human being stitched together with fishing line or something?" "More like stitched together with magic." When he heard the word magic, Ben relaxed. I could see him filing me straight into the crazy category. The way I dressed and the hair probably didn't help. "No," he said, shaking his head with an apologetic look on his face. "I don't think this is going to—" He stuttered to a stop, his eyes riveted on the ball of bright pink light that hovered in the air between my hands. I spread my hands farther apart, and the ball of light grew. Then I pushed my hands together, collapsing the ball until it was a dense little blob about the size of a softball. I tossed it gently in the air and held it there, suspended for several seconds, before letting it fall back down into my hand. The really good stuff wasn't visible. This was the witch equivalent of smoke and mirrors. Lots of sparkle, but little magic. But as evidence of the existence of magic when attempting to persuade the magically uneducated, it worked better than the more sophisticated magic. Ben closed his mouth and finally looked away from the shining ball, back at me. "And that's supposed to be magic?" I found it difficult to lie to him, so I said, "It's pretty basic stuff, but yes." I pushed my hands together until the ball of light collapsed inside them. The look on his face changed, became tenser, and his fingers curled, not quite making a fist. "And what you did earlier, when you first got here, when you came through the service door, was that some kind of magic?" This really wasn't my day. I told Camille I shouldn't go around prying into people's innermost thoughts. People weren't practicing dummies. And if I say yes, then I'd ask what you did to me. "Nothing, I swear. I didn't do anything to you at all." I had to force myself to stop babbling. Ben stirred my conscience to new heights. I was not a fan. It wasn't like I didn't already have a strong moral compass. It didn't exactly need amplifying. "You did some kind of magic, but you didn't do anything to me? If I believed in magic, shiny ball of light notwithstanding, I'd say that was hard to believe." I sighed. I peeked. Just a little peek. What else could I say? I'd violated the man's privacy, deeply and intimately, and I'd known it was wrong. I let Camille, with her talk of needing practice and letting the universe guide me, influence my ultimate decision. And if I was honest with myself, I'd been curious. Ben Kowalski intrigued me. His jaw tensed. "You peeked at what exactly?" He looked pissed, and suddenly very, very tall. I got it. I'd be pissed too. On the positive side, he probably wouldn't be so angry about my invasion of his privacy if he didn't buy the idea of magic on some level. Inside your head, I guess? I took a step back and quickly added, but not like mind reading. I'm not telepathic or anything. All I got was a general sense of you. I edited a little out when I added that you're a trustworthy man. He rubbed his jaw with his knuckles and finally moved away from the door. So what exactly did your boyfriend tell you to do? My ex-boyfriend. I gave him a cautiously hopeful look. So you believe me? Oh no. I'm just curious what plans you have for poor Mr. Chalmers. No way I'm letting you disrespect a body placed in my care. I inched toward the door. When he moved to the side, I hoofed it out of the office before he could change his mind, lock me in there, and call the police. I had no desire to spend any time in the loony bin, and Cornelius would be pissed if he had to bail me out if it went a different direction. Once I was in the hallway and had a clear path to an exterior door, I answered his question. So the first thing is to check that Mr. Chalmers is dead. Fully. Not reversibly dead. Chapter 5. How dead is dead? Ben looked at me like I was speaking in tongues. You're saying death is a question of degree? He paused. Partially dead seems problematic. If you're a golem, I guess it happens. Not that I knew that much about golems. Ben held open the swinging door to the prep room and motioned for me to go ahead. And someone can be in Mr. Chalmers' state and be partially not dead? Or what did you call it? Reversibly dead. He made an annoyed sound. Can a person look dead but still be alive? Not a person, but a golem? Yeah. That's what Alex, my ex, just told me. Ben groaned. This conversation is painful. I eyed the covered form of Mr. Chalmers. Ben must have stopped just long enough to pull the sheet back up before he'd followed me into the office. He followed my gaze and lifted an eyebrow. So can I check that Mr. Chalmers is all the way dead? I followed the question with a smile that was at least 2 parts grimace. He looked at me for a few seconds, then said, Does it involve anything invasive? I shook my head. But I do have to touch him. And I'd like a closer look at his creation tattoos. If I say stop, you stop. I tried to contain my surprise. I didn't think I'd been all that persuasive. Is that a yes? A very reserved one. Fair enough. He folded the sheet back from Chalmers' body. What are you looking for? Life. Magic. A spark of something. My hand hovered over the golem's chest. Alex said I'd know right away. Because Alex hadn't been specific, but had been sure I wouldn't miss it, I was expecting something big. Hence my hesitation. I glanced at Ben, worried he might change his mind if I didn't find something in a hurry. He looked calm enough, but that might just mean there was a mix of acceptance and denial swirling around his head. Right. I was the pro here. Time to see what was left of Chalmers, if anything, while Ben was still cooperative. Alex said I should be able to use my magical sight via touch. He wasn't wrong. Magical sight wasn't about seeing with the eyes. A connection of some sort was required between the witch and the subject. I'd just been crutching off my eyesight. Camille had encouraged it as an intermediary stage of learning until I mastered the skill. Given what had happened when I'd both touched and gazed into Ben's eyes, I'd say that I was still far from mastery. Since I could hardly gaze into the dead guy's eyes, I went with Alex's suggestion. I placed my left hand flat on Chalmers' chest. And there it was. Not a spark of life. The opposite of life. A sucking void, dark and endless, cold. Stephanie? The more I looked, the less I found. Like falling into a hole without a bottom. A bottomless hole. A cold, bottomless hole. Stephanie! The next thing I knew, Ben was yanking on my arm. Hard. My shoulder was tender where he jerked me. That seemed awfully un-Ben-like of him. What the? The world tilted under me. Ben reached out a hand and steadied me. You're really cold. Is that normal for you? With his warm hand clasped around my upper arm, I felt more grounded, and like I wasn't about to keel over sideways. And now that I wasn't about to land on my rear, I had an idea what had happened. Not normal. Not at all. I could feel the beginnings of a growl in my chest. Teach me to take magical advice from a wizard. I was going to kick him in his soft bits the next time I saw him. Ben's eyebrows lifted. You want to sit? He let go of my arm and returned a few seconds later with a stool. Thanks. I sat down, just in case. Passing out on the floor of the prep room was the last thing I wanted to do today. I glanced at the irreversibly dead Chalmers and amended that to the second to last thing I wanted to do today. Touching that sucking void again topped the list. I wrapped my arms tight around my body. I've probably got a sweatshirt or a jacket somewhere, if you think that might help. Ben wasn't just nice. Considerate, thoughtful, generous. Yeah, he went above and beyond nice by leaps and bounds. Too bad he wouldn't remember anything about this evening. There was the thought to keep me warm. Nothing like a solid dose of frustration, topped by a dollop of righteous anger to keep a girl toasty. Here he was, doing what was right by his client and his employee, and for his troubles, he'd be getting his brain scrubbed with the equivalent of a magical toilet brush. Just about the opposite of fair and just. I could say it was due to my lapse in judgment, and it really was. I should have sealed the room for sound before I made the call. Heck, I should have just watched the door. It wasn't like Ben had been sneaky or actively tried to eavesdrop. But I blame the society for its archaic stance on, well, everything. Secrecy, humans, mind wipes in general. He looked at me expectantly, and I realized I hadn't answered his question. I rubbed my arms briskly and then uncrossed them. No, I'm fine. Thanks. He nodded slowly, like he didn't believe me. Smart man. What did you find? Oh, he's dead. I glanced again at the murdered man laid out on the table. Completely. Irreversibly. Not coming back, dead. A pained look crossed Ben's face. I feel like there's a breakdown in communication here. Like you're mostly speaking English because I understand the words, but then when you stop talking, it's like I made a mistake and maybe you're actually speaking Dutch. I choked on an inappropriate laugh. Yeah, you're not far off. But only because you see death as black and white. Death is binary. He raised his eyebrows. Poor guy. I felt bad messing with his worldview when he was just going to forget this all happened anyway. Add magic, and suddenly everything isn't quite so clear. I knew how confusing magic could be. Witches were made, not born. That meant that I'd been as ignorant as Ben about 10 years ago. Almost as ignorant as Ben. When the flicker of magic lived inside you, you couldn't be completely unaware. All right. I'm sure I'll regret asking. But what's the difference between dead and super dead? The sucking, black hole-like void that now existed in the place where the essence of Chalmers' self used to be. That was the difference between dead and super dead. But I wasn't sure how to explain that to someone who hadn't felt the cold pull of that void. Even thinking about it made goosebumps rise on my arms, and I rubbed them again. If you see life as a switch that's turned on or off, it's hard to explain. Think about life as a warm 10 and death as a cold 0. Chalmers is a stone-cold -1. He's sucking the heat from anything that gets close. Ben shifted away from the body, only a few inches, but it was telling. You're telling me he's so dead that he's leeching life from people around him? The service door clicked shut, startling us both. Even before I turned, I knew who it was, and I was going to bloody his pretty face. My ex addressed a bewildered Ben. Robert Chalmers can't harm you. Alex turned to me and said, You, on the other hand, should be more careful. I didn't think about it. Nothing to consider, really. I hurled a ball of energy straight at the arrogant ass. Chapter 6. My ex knight in less than shining armor. Alex pulled his sword from thin air and blocked the attack. Sloppy, he shook his head. You haven't been practicing, have you? Ben touched my arm, which made me realize I'd raised it in an offensive position. I lowered my hand. Ben, Alex Valois, a guy I thought I could rely on, despite his massive ego and even bigger chip on his shoulder. I turned to Alex, and in a tone he couldn't mistake for anything but deadly serious, said, Touch a hair on this man's head, and I will castrate you. Alex's sword disappeared as he sheathed it. He lifted his hands in a gesture of peace, but I'd believe that when Ben walked away from this meeting a free man. Ben looked between the two of us and said, That door locks automatically. Magic, Alex said, but he was looking at me. I couldn't leave you alone with a possibly half-dead golem, and since it seems you didn't use appropriate protections, it looks like my concern was well-founded. I glared at him. Because I'm so fragile and unable to protect myself that you need to run to my rescue? The man didn't change, whether I was dating him or not. You could have just warned me. Ben raised his hand. If you two could just take it down a notch, maybe one of you could tell me if Chalmers is an immediate hazard. Do we need to do anything to contain whatever it is he's got? I shot Alex a last warning look, and then assumed a more neutral expression and said to Ben, He doesn't have a communicable disease, so there's not any concern about preventing the spread of infection. Alex snorted. You know that, do you? Well, that you would have said on the phone, wouldn't you? Alex inclined his head. Did you get a chance to investigate his creation tats? Ben grabbed a pair of gloves from a tray next to Chalmers' body and said as he pulled them on, You broke in before we got that far. He flipped the sheet back and pointed to the tattoos located just above the pubic bone and in the groin area. I assume you mean these? Yes, I do. Alex leaned in to get a closer look. I did the same, careful not to bump heads with Alex. See? There. The cuts are small but deep, and they definitely didn't happen at the time of the supposed car accident. The car accident I'm relatively certain of. Ben pulled the sheet past Chalmers' knees. The bruising across the chest, evidence of a head injury, and the damage to his knees. All of those injuries are consistent with other auto fatalities I've seen. He indicated the relevant injuries as he spoke. Alex nodded. Makes sense. It does? I asked. Since when does a golem wear a seatbelt? Oh. I hated it when I caught on just a second slower than the oh-so-brilliant enforcer with a Texas-sized ego. Since I'm not up to date on the ins and outs of golem physiology, Ben said, maybe you could fill me in. The cuts were made first, prior to the accident. They would have made him more susceptible to injury. Alex pulled the sheet back up, covering the body. since it would be almost impossible to do that kind of damage without his knowledge. He had to know. Making it more likely he'd wear a seatbelt, I finished. I'd have figured that out on my own, eventually. Right. But if he was aware, as the bruising from the seatbelt indicates, then why didn't he have the damage to the tats repaired? He didn't have time? Ben ventured. I nodded. The tats were damaged, and the accident happened immediately afterward, before he had any opportunity to get them fixed. What are the chances? Very poor, Alex replied. I'd place odds on the accident not being an accident at all, but planned. My general feeling that something was off, Chalmers showing up in a human funeral home, and the damage to his tats, it all pointed to foul play. Ben looked between Alex and me. So we're all agreed. This man was almost definitely murdered. Chapter 7. Modern Paranormal Policing. Ben was probably right. Robert Chalmers likely had been murdered. Small problem? It might not matter. The society had some old-fashioned values, and not of the 1950s Leave It to Beaver variety. More Inquisition meets secret society, with a touch of sadism thrown in for fun. Learning that was not one of my favorite society moments. Go ahead, Alex said. He's your pet. You explain it to him. Ben didn't even flinch at being called a pet, but Alex's arrogance made me twitch. I lobbed a serendipitous glowing pink ball at Alex's backside, and score! A satisfying swirl of smoke drifted to the ceiling. I tried not to smirk as Alex grunted and rubbed his backside. When he was done inspecting for scorch marks, he said, "Don't start a fight you can't finish. Your combat skills are nowhere near up to par." I'll agree if you can refrain from calling my employer a pet. Ben looked at the two of us with some incredulity. Can you guys stop bickering and take a second to tell me what we do next? If this man has been murdered, then we need to call the authorities. And if he's not actually human, I'm guessing the authorities in question aren't the local police or the sheriff's office. I sighed. First, Alex is a member of emergency response, which is as close to police as the society has. The society? Ben shook his head. Alex dropped some of his attitude and replied, "The Society of the Study of Paranormal and Occult Phenomena, our local governing body." Turning to me, he said, "You do know we're going to have to wipe this guy's memories, right?" I touched Ben's arm and said to him, "Don't worry about it. We'll deal with it." Ben looked worried about the possibility, and Alex amused that I thought I could prevent it. I wasn't about to admit that I didn't have the clout to officially prevent a memory wipe. Ben didn't need the stress of worrying when or if it might happen, especially since I wasn't going to let the society screw with his head. Period. If I had to take drastic measures, so be it. My word was enough for him for now, it seemed. After giving me an inscrutable look, Ben said, "That's good, because I like my memories just as they are." He turned to Alex, and in a businesslike manner asked Alex what he planned to do about the apparent murder. Contain whatever magic is still attached to the body, burn it, and get rid of any evidence of his nature, including your memories. Ben looked between us, searching for some answer he wasn't seeing. What about the part where Mr. Chalmers was almost definitely murdered? That had been his original question, one that Alex had sidestepped. I shifted to stand closer to Ben. I didn't want there to be any confusion as to whose side I was on. The society isn't officially concerned with murder. They dislike exposure and will certainly punish those who risk a reveal scandal. But killing someone isn't necessarily illegal. This whole memory wipe question has to do with me being a possible reveal scandal? Ben frowned. I shrugged. It wouldn't do much good to deny it. I'd already as good as promised to handle the memory wipe looming in his future. He was a reveal risk. I'd just find some other way to deal with it. Ben's gaze fell on the sheet-covered man, who was likely murdered, and who wasn't likely to get justice. It made me itchy, and I was familiar with the society's deficits. I could only imagine what an upstanding guy like Ben was thinking. But his next question went a different direction entirely. Chalmers was a golem. Is that what you both are? Which, I pointed to Alex, wizard. Not gender-specific, just different types of magic. Alex studied Ben. You're buying all this? Magic, golems, witches, wizards. After a brief hesitation, Ben nodded, and Alex said, "Then you can help us." Are you asking me to help cover up a murder? Alex replied in even, cool tones. No. I'm asking you to help dispose of the body. Discreetly. Which is the definition of your occupation. Are you in trouble if I say no? It took a second for me to realize that Ben was asking me that question. Alex replied before I got a chance. She's annoying and pushes all my buttons. But I'll make sure nothing that happens with Chalmers comes back on Star. Ben raised his eyebrows. Star? I tucked a strand of raven hair behind my ear. That's my witch name. Long story. Uh-huh. Well, I'm relieved to hear you won't be beheaded for your actions. Hanged, I said. The society is into hanging. Only after I corrected him did I realize he'd been kidding. Oops. Ben closed his eyes, and I'd swear the poor guy was counting to 10 or chanting some Zen mantra. When he opened them, he seemed pretty calm, so it must have worked. Good to know you won't be hung. But outside of the fact that Robert Chalmers was quite possibly murdered, there's also the very real concern that you're asking me to defy a dead man's last wishes. I won't do something illegal that not only endangers my business, but also disrespects the deceased's desires. Golems are always cremated, Alex said. So we're not asking you to defy his wishes. Except my instructions directly contradict that. I'm to bury him following an open casket viewing. You're telling me burial would be unusual for a golem? Ben looked to me to confirm Alex's assertion. Alex typically inspired immediate respect, so it was interesting to see Ben defer to me over my ex. Probably because Ben hadn't seen Alex's best self. I did tend to bring out an even more peevish than usual side to him these days. Yes, very unusual. Golems are always cremated, after certain precautions are made to ensure any residual magic is fully contained. Ben pulled up a stool. So we, cremate him? After you do some voodoo? And I'm supposed to bury an empty casket? Maybe we can put the ashes in the casket? I gave Ben a hopeful look. Ben took off his gloves and chucked them several feet at the nearest waste bin. He missed. Won't work. Remember, it's an open casket ceremony. That's actually in your instructions? You've got to be kidding me. My hopeful look faded. I really didn't have anything. No body, no open casket. That is a problem. Ah, Alex said. I might know how we can fix that. If you ask Ben to break the contract... No. This is more like bending it. There'd still be a body in a casket. It just wouldn't be Chalmers. Sometimes knowing a guy who'd lived through the Crusades and all the intervening years did pay off. When he decided to be cooperative and share some of that knowledge he'd acquired through the years. So, spill. You know where we can get a body? Maybe cast an illusion. But that didn't seem very persuasive to me. Illusions could be tricky, and that was hardly Alex's specialty. Breaking and entering, yes. Illusions, not so much. Not so much as get a body, as make one. Alex flashed his all-too-rare grin. But we'll need Camille's help. You think you can get her on board, even though it's not official? Not official was promising to Ben. his business, and the burial contract he was trying to fulfill. Because officially, all Alex had to do was contain the magic, burn the body, and prevent knowledge of the enhanced from leaking out into the world at large. You know witches, always entrepreneurial. You've got cash? I gave him a falsely sweet look. I already knew the answer. Alex definitely had cash. One of the benefits to living donkey's years. Something witches, with their only slightly elongated lives, frequently made up for with their mad bargaining skills. Sure, I've got cash. Alex unclipped his mobile phone from his belt and handed it to me. Call Camille and tell her we need to cook up a doppelganger. Chapter 8. The Witching Hour, or Happy Hour? I'd had no clue Alex meant it literally when he said cook. I wasn't looking forward to experiencing the smell of baked flesh. Camille told me it stuck inside your nose, more like the smell of human decay than burning hair and tissue. I handed the phone back to Alex with that lovely image in my mind. Camille will help, but I'm supposed to tell you that she's only doing it because I asked. I didn't mention that she also thought it would be a good opportunity to show me what I'd been missing by skipping over my alchemy lessons. No need to bring up one of my witchy failings, and it wasn't like there were tons of alchemic experts running around. Alchemy had only recently been removed from the big-time taboo list. Not 10 years ago, anyone openly dabbling in alchemy would have been in danger of seriously pissing off the wrong people. Alex gave me a suspicious look. What are you not saying? I fluttered my lashes at him. No easy task, given how much mascara I was wearing. Nothing important. While he had the exceptional hearing of most of the enhanced community, it seemed he couldn't get past a simple shielding spell. Good to know they worked, when I remembered to use them. Also, Alex was anti-alchemy, so no need to rub his nose in the fact that, technically, what we'd be doing was his most hated form of magic. Either he didn't know, or he was turning a blind eye in favor of the easiest solution to our dead body problem. So, what's the plan? Ben was still perched on his rolling stool. In his white coat and with his earnest expression, he looked like a doctor. Star. Alex gave me a knowing look. He acted as if he knew what was going on inside my head. Sometimes he did. Frequently he didn't. That had been half of our problem, his false assumptions. The other half of our relationship woes might have stemmed from stunted communication, on both sides. Lessons learned, I hoped. Right, I shook my head. The past was the past. She's agreed to meeting us at her place at midnight. Midnight. Is there some magical significance to that? Ben asked. No. She's had a half a bottle of wine and an excellent meal. If she's going to be up all hours cooking up a dead guy replacement, she needs a nap. Her words, not mine. Alex muttered something unrepeatable. Well, it's 9, Alex. If we'd called earlier, we'd have caught her before she had anything to drink. You know how finicky she is about practicing under the influence. Your mentor's a nut job, and about half the witch you are. My blood pressure skyrocketed. With a polite smile at Ben, I said, Give us a second. I'll just pull up Chalmers' file. He seemed hesitant to leave me alone with Alex, but after giving both of us a piercing look, he said, I'll be in the office when you're done. I waited until the swinging door made a quiet shushing noise, indicating it had closed. Then I did something I've been avoiding for some time now. I used my magical sight on Alex. I only got a split second before he shut me down, but in that instant, I saw a whole lot of dark, and not a little guilt. He narrowed his eyes and whispered, Don't. He was right. It was a terrible invasion, but I was hacked off. He was being an incredible jerk, and it felt good to screw with him for a change. What had I been thinking going out with him? Dating Alex, living with him, had been an adventure, at first. But the moodiness and the darkness, it was too much for me. Yeah, he was smoking hot, even when you look past the glamour that clung to him like a second skin. But that didn't make up for everything else. Alex was a lot of work to be around, let alone be with. I get it. You're pissed off at the world, and I push your buttons more than most people. But you're also a pro, Alex. And under all that obnoxious angst, you're really a decent person. A fair person. He pinched the bridge of his nose, but didn't reply. The guy had a hard time seeing his good traits, all because of some bad choices he'd made as a kid. How long could one man carry the guilt of past choices? I didn't know, but I was sure Alex was hitting the outer limit. It was a good thing he had an amazing sense of self-preservation that went hand in hand with all his baggage. Finally, he said, "What exactly do you want?" "Do the right thing. And to heck with the society." "The right thing is to cremate Chalmers to ensure his remains don't pose a danger to others." He raised an eyebrow. "We're doing that." "Come on." I caught his gaze and grinned. "You know you want to know who did it." My grin widened. "And how?" He smiled back at me. It wasn't wide, but it was genuine. My heart skipped a beat, and I remembered part of the reason we'd been an item. But every time I reacted to his smiles, I was reminded how rare they were. I needed to be with someone who brought out my light, not my dark. "Yeah, I would like to know." The smile disappeared. "But I'm guessing you want to chase down the killer and pin some obscure violation on him." "Or her. But that's not fair. With a proper investigation, we might actually find that there was a legitimate society violation. It may be that, just this once, the society's archaic laws and justice overlap." I pinched my thumb and forefinger together. "It only takes this much." "Small, but large enough to punish a murderer?" "Now you're getting it." "What do you think?" He sighed. "I think it would be nice to do the right thing for a change." "Speaking of doing the right thing..." "No, Ben is your problem. And good luck, because there's no way you're convincing Cornelius to keep his memory intact." And sometimes Alex got that mind-reading business right. It was especially obnoxious when he naysayed me before I could even articulate my thoughts. In this instance, I could use his help with Cornelius. He and Alex are friends, sort of. Cornelius might be Alex's boss, but they were close, sort of. Cornelius was basically the sheriff in our little microcosm of weird, though technically he was the chief operations officer for the society. Whatever his title, there was no getting past the fact that he was a hardcore rule follower, and Ben was a security risk. I clenched my teeth to keep from saying something regrettable. It wasn't Alex's fault Cornelius had an accountant's hatred of risk and the flexibility of a drill sergeant. I needed to make my own pitch for Ben, and while I was at it, I was going to give Cornelius a piece of my mind. Messing with people's heads just because they'd ended up on the wrong side of the wall of secrets and silence was unfair, unjust, and downright medieval. Take a breath and try to move past your outrage. That's not going to win Cornelius over. Try giving him a reasonable alternative. Some kind of assurance that Ben isn't going to rat us out to the world. If you do, the conversation may last more than 30 seconds. Right. I swallowed my anger as best I could. I know that, but it's hard not to be mad given the context. Go grab your boyfriend. I want to have a look at the file. We have a murder to solve, right? My boyfriend? I bit my lip. I would not rise to the bait. Instead, I turned on heel and headed for the office. Besides, boyfriend was a step up from pet. It could even be perceived as a compliment, given the fact my last boyfriend was Alex himself. Chapter 9. The butler did it. When I walked into the office, I found Ben scrolling through his accounting ledger. "You pulled Chalmers's records?" I asked. Ben nodded and pointed to a file on the corner of his desk. "Since I didn't take the payment, I was checking to see who had actually been charged for the service. The person arranging the service isn't always the one footing the bill." I grabbed the file, then perched on the edge of Ben's desk. "Nice. You're already building our suspect pool. Maybe you were a detective in a former life." He glanced at my rear, mostly in a "why are you sitting on my desk" way, and then his gaze traveled higher and met mine. "Definitely not." "Is there a wife?" I asked, as I flipped open the file. "It's always the spouse." "There's a Mrs. Chalmers. It's in the file." He tapped a few keys and his printer spat out a page. He stood up and retrieved the sheet, then headed for the door. He opened it and waited for me to precede him. Polite? Or just convinced I wasn't trustworthy enough to be left unsupervised in his office? I guessed I'd find out when this little golem problem was resolved. If I still had a job, I was calling that a win. I hopped off his desk and exited the office, Chalmers' file in hand. Once the door shut with a click, he said, "I thought it was always the butler." "You're thinking of mystery novels. I'm talking about real life." "Real life, with witches and wizards." Looking over my shoulder, I frowned at him. I thought we were past this. Magic is real, and sometimes it even sparkles. What else do you need to know? I shoved the swinging door to the prep room a little too hard, and it banged against the wall. "Don't tell me you've set her off now," Alex said. "No," Ben replied. "We were just discussing the merits of butlers over wives as suspects." "Oh, yeah. If there's a butler, my money's on him." "Yeah, that's what I said." Ben handed the piece of paper in his hand to Alex. "Robert Chalmers prepaid for his own funeral. Do you guys have an explanation for that piece of evidence?" "How do you know?" I had to ask, because no golem in his right mind would make arrangements to be buried like a non-magical human. "Personal check." Alex handed me the sheet of paper. On it was a copy of a check for a rather large sum of money, signed by one Robert Chalmers. But since you didn't take payment, you can't be sure it was him. Maybe someone else with access to his checkbook wrote it. Yes, I was making a wild guess, but golems didn't pay to get buried in the ground, with an open casket no less. They just didn't. "And he didn't notice when 10 grand disappeared from his account?" Ben looked unconvinced. "Maybe not, depending on the account. Golems can be long-lived, and correspondingly very wealthy." Alex shrugged. "A lengthy lifespan could be manipulated as a financial advantage, and frequently is by the enhanced community. I also happen to know that Robert wasn't hard up for cash. That still doesn't mean he wouldn't miss such a large withdrawal. And I find it difficult to believe that my assistant director would accept a check without ID." Ben held up a hand. "I can't call her. She's traveling out of the country on a combined retirement and 20th anniversary trip." "So, Ben, I have some bad news for you." I smacked the file I'd been clutching against Alex's chest and then turned back to Ben. "Here's the thing. You've got the basics. Magic is real. And sparkles." Ben crossed his arms. I gave him my serious stuff forthcoming look. "Right. But there's also the non-sparkly, sneaky variety, which of course is morally questionable, depending on how it's used." "She's talking about mind control," Alex said. "More accurately, persuasion. Your assistant could have spoken with a woman and still be willing to swear 5 minutes later that she had been a he. That's how persuasion works." "So a phone call to my former assistant director would be pointless?" Ben shook his head. "Read the file and tell me what you think. Other than disclosing there's a Mrs. Chalmers who is listed as his wife, there isn't much more information other than service and burial instructions." Alex had set the file down on a counter and was flipping through it. "And this form that's included, the body disposition and authorization. How common is it for your clients to have something like this prepared? Given that Mr. Chalmers wasn't terminally ill or elderly and died in an accident, I'd say not that common at all." Ben pulled up his rolling stool and sat down. "A good portion of my clientele want to believe they'll live forever." I glanced at Chalmers' corpse, once again covered. "Well, I certainly wouldn't think a golem would anticipate his death," I sighed, "since I'm pretty sure the butler didn't do it. How about we start with a list of suspects? Alex, you knew Chalmers, right?" When Alex nodded, I said, "So? Who are the most likely suspects? He has a wife, but who else?" "Oh, Robert had a wife, and a mistress, and a girlfriend." "Good grief," I muttered. "You've got to be kidding me. When did he sleep?" "Do golems need to sleep?" Ben asked in a curiously non-judgmental tone. I sighed. Excellent point. I didn't think they did. Not as much as I did, at any rate. "All right. You guys have to admit that 3 women and 1 man practically screams motive for murder. Any one of them could have offed him in a fit of jealousy. And," I pointed at both of them, "they make a much better set of suspects than the non-existent butler." "We've got a few hours to kill before we start cooking up a doppelganger at Camille's." A pained look crossed Alex's face. "I can't believe I'm saying this, but I think we should interview the wife." "Oh, yeah. I'm in." Ben was on his feet in a flash. I wasn't sure whether to be shocked by Ben's interest or pleased it would be so easy to keep an eye on him for the evening. Alex might not rat out Ben and his newfound knowledge to Cornelius, but these things had a way of getting back to the big boss man, and I wanted to at least make a pitch for Ben keeping his memory before Cornelius had a chance to form preconceived ideas about him. Having Ben's involuntary memory wipe on my conscience was a broken promise I didn't want on my conscience. I liked him, but I'd feel that way about any hapless human tangled in society politics. Probably. My gaze wandered his way. He was tall, with neatly trimmed red hair and an open expression. I bet he didn't have any problems demonstrating the sympathy his clients so desperately needed. He wasn't wearing a suit today, but still had on slacks, a dress shirt, and a different, equally bland tie. But he also sported a sneaky flair that I'd caught sight of earlier when he'd perched on the stool. Wildly inappropriate giraffe socks. Speaking of early judgments, that generic tie predilection of his had definitely led me astray. Alex stood next to him, making for an interesting comparison. Alex was also tall, even taller than Ben. His dark hair was in need of a trim, like it always seemed to be, and he was sporting at least 3 days of stubble. Also, per usual, his attire was clean, but slightly disheveled, like he'd left his clothes in the dryer overnight. He probably had. I was having a hard time envisioning the 3 of us cooperating to conduct an investigation of any kind. "Are you coming, or do you want to hang out in the cool room with Chalmers?" Alex asked. While I'd been daydreaming, Ben had rolled Chalmers back into the refrigeration room and grabbed a sports coat. Both he and Alex were both standing by the door waiting for me. Wouldn't miss this for anything. True fact. The why of that statement, though, I wasn't about to analyze. Chapter 10. The Ice Queen Did It. Annoyance and amusement warred briefly when Mrs. Chalmers' butler answered her door. I studiously avoided catching either Ben or Alex's eye. The mere existence of a butler was not evidence that the butler did it. He gave us a condescending look, a neat trick for someone who looked to be about my age, and said begrudgingly, "Richard Fox, Lydia's personal assistant, at your service." Without waiting for us to identify ourselves, he swung the door wide and gestured for us to enter. "She'll receive you in her office." After closing the door behind us, he led the way down the large, formal hallway. As Ben, Alex, and I followed obediently behind, I couldn't help thinking that P.A. Richard could have been a butler in another life. He had the superiority and formal manners down. Replace his expensive tailored shirt and natty dress slacks with a dark suit and white gloves, and I'd call him Jeeves. Alex lifted an eyebrow and tipped his head in Richard's direction. "A little young," I mouthed. Alex rolled his eyes. I was pretty sure I was the only person who could elicit that particular response from him, which was oddly satisfying. I gave Richard another look, with just a touch of magical sight this time, but I didn't catch any leaking magic that identified him as enhanced. If only I'd been more diligent with my homework, I'd trust what I was, or wasn't, seeing. Youngish, probably mid-20s, not poorly paid, and average-looking. That was all I got from him. One thing was certain. He wasn't nearly attractive enough to be a golem. They were notoriously good-looking. A natural result when you got to choose your kid's body parts. If there was anything natural about scavenging bits and pieces of different people to make a new person. Richard paused at a closed door, knocked, then swung it open after a barely perceptible pause. He motioned for us to enter. It was all so weirdly formal. I half expected to see the equivalent of a receiving room, not a study, on the other side of the door. As I entered, a stunning woman stood up from behind a massive, tidy desk. Just my luck. All that wood surface and not a single visible handwriting exemplar. Lydia Chalmers didn't look the type to leave scraps of paper lying about. She was all business. From her sleek chignon, without a stray strand of hair to soften her face, to the perfectly tailored suit that displayed her feminine figure to advantage, but lacked any warmth. When our little party came to a stop in front of her desk, she excused Richard and said, "Alex, introduce me to your colleagues. Ben Kowalski." Alex indicated Ben, but didn't linger before moving to me. "And Star, we have news about your husband." Lydia gestured at the seats in front of her desk and then gracefully sank into her chair. "So you said on the phone. He's out of town at the moment." She paused, tilted her head, and said, "Or is he?" With a cool look at Ben, she said, "Are you affiliated in any way with Kowalski Funeral Home?" We agreed on the ride over that Alex would do most of the speaking. He was the one with the most experience with both the enhanced community and society rules. He was an enforcer, after all. He'd also told us in the car ride over that he'd met Lydia before. "He's the owner and funeral director," Alex said. "That's why we're here. Your husband's body is being stored there and is scheduled for burial tomorrow." She was so still that I thought she hadn't heard Alex. Then I saw it, a small twitch in her left eye. "Have you damaged his body?" Alex turned to Ben, and for the first time that evening, my new boss looked nervous. "Your husband's remains have been prepared for burial." "Is that your euphemistic way of saying that my husband has been mutilated? More precisely, that you've embalmed him?" Ben nodded slowly. "Those were the instructions I received." Lydia's nostrils pinched. Under all the layers of restraint and civility, she was livid. In a perfectly calm voice, she said, "So be it." And then, very quietly, More to herself than the room full of people, she said. A child was obviously too much to ask of him. What embalming had to do with the inability to have children, I had no idea. A dead guy couldn't exactly get the job done, could he? Then again, Golem's reproductive methods were a fuzzy gray area. How the heck did they procreate if they were stitching together parts from other people? I wasn't the queasy sort, but ew. Can you tell us about Robert's travel plans? Alex asked. When he left, where was he scheduled to stay? When he was expected to return? She picked up the phone on her desk and punched one of the buttons. Richard, bring me a copy of Robert's itinerary. And then we waited in tense silence for Richard to appear. I'd have filled the silence with questions. We'd hardly scratched the surface so far. But Alex was the expert. Richard entered the room with an air of quiet deference. The guy was annoyingly butler-like. I wanted to shake him and tell him to get a backbone. Figuratively. Literally, his posture couldn't have been better. Lydia took the sheaf of papers from Richard with a small smile, the first sign of warmth she'd displayed. I tried again to get a good look at him, to see what exactly he was, and this time I saw just a hint of magic. I wasn't sure what type of enhanced being he was, only that he wasn't fully human. I shot Alex a peevish look. I'd bet my favorite black eyeliner that Alex knew. Lydia flipped through the papers, then handed them to Alex, the implication being she had no clue where her darling husband had planned to travel. Alex accepted the paperwork, and after perusing it, asked, Do you have any evidence that your husband ever arrived in Pittsburgh? Do you mean, did he call me to check in and say he'd landed safely? No. We didn't have that kind of relationship. You might check with his girlfriend. It's possible she heard from him, unless he didn't make it that far. Lydia turned to Richard, standing quietly to the side. Richard, could you please provide Alex with Abby's contact information? Brooks as well, so we've covered all the bases. Of course. Richard didn't look appalled. He didn't look anything. Just pulled out a small electronic device and started tapping away. After a few seconds, he moved to Lydia's desk and dashed off 2 numbers on a sticky note. I was closest, so I took it from him. He'd made note of the names and numbers of the women. That he had Robert's lover's contact information in his PDA didn't seem surprising to anyone else in the room, so I bit my lip. Occasionally, my suburban roots threatened to reveal themselves, and I like to minimize their effect on my witchy life. Alex snatched the sticky note from my hand with a warning look. I smoothed over my features, trying for just a fraction of the blandness Lydia had mastered. With a husband like Robert, the woman probably had a lot of practice. Alex pulled out the printout of Chalmers' check from a file folder tucked under his arm and handed it to Lydia. Is this your husband's writing? Lydia took the piece of paper and examined it briefly. No. But she didn't return it to Alex, and I could hear the paper crackle under her tensed fingers. Does it look like his handwriting? Alex asked very softly, almost kindly. It does. Her fingers clenched, crumpling the paper. She looked down at the creased page with surprise, but then her features blanked again, and she handed it back to Alex without further comment. What makes you think your husband didn't write the check? Alex asked. The fact that it's for a burial. No golem in his right mind would make arrangements to have himself buried by a human. The idea's ridiculous, as you well know. Lydia gave Alex a cold, hard stare. Robert was very much in his right mind. Alex didn't blink, didn't twitch even an eyelash at her nasty tone. To clarify, the handwriting on the check looks like his? When Lydia inclined her head, he said, "Neither Star nor I are interested in tarnishing your husband's good name." Lydia turned her icy stare on me. I nodded. I had no clue if that was the right response, and I held my breath, half afraid the contained woman would completely lose it, jump over her desk, and beat the snot out of me. After a split second of much too intense scrutiny, Lydia dismissed me. "Any other questions?" Richard asked from the corner of the room. "Mrs. Chalmers has a busy evening ahead of her." Lydia didn't deny it. Because her husband dying was just another item to add to her calendar? The woman was like a snowy mountain peak hiding a soon-to-erupt volcano. Alex nudged me. Everyone but me was standing, so I rose to my feet. Lydia looked expectantly at Alex. "When should we expect the body?" Alex considered the question, probably adding in a few extra hours to compensate for Camille's perceived incompetence, then said, "Preparations should be complete by tomorrow early morning." Addressing Lydia, Ben said, "If you could provide a location, we can have Mr. Chalmers' remains delivered to your preferred funeral home. Again, I'm very sorry for your loss." He took a deep breath. "If you'd prefer for us to handle the arrangements, Kowalski's is prepared to do what's necessary to accommodate any special needs your family has." Bit of a shocker, that one, because I didn't even know what those special needs were, other than containing loose magic and cremation. I'd never been in a golem's passing or seen funeral rites. Obviously, Ben didn't have a clue what he'd just offered. Lydia inspected Ben with new interest. Then, jaw-dropper, she said, "I'll give it some consideration. You'll hear from Richard by 9 tomorrow with my decision." Richard escorted us out of the house with great efficiency. I'd say haste, but for the fact that he maintained his butler-like decorum. Once outside the house, Alex clapped Ben on the back. "Good job, Kowalski. I might like you." "Thanks." Ben loosed his tie. "It seemed the decent thing to do. Please tell me I'm not on the hook for a goat sacrifice or something equally bizarre. You mentioned cremation before. I can handle cremation." Alex got that shifty, trouble-ahead look that I knew way, way too well. We'll talk about it if Lydia lets you conduct the service." Then he grinned at Ben. "But if she takes you up on your offer, you might have an in with the society." My feet tangled underneath me, and only Alex's quick reflexes kept me from wiping out in Lydia's driveway. "That's brilliant, Alex." I almost wanted to hug him. Almost. I was well past the breakup stage that included wanting to do physical violence to him, but hugs were a long, long way off. "You're welcome," he replied, with a touch too much arrogance. What did I ever see in that cocky twerp? Actually, that was unfair. He was an incredible wizard, and he had talent tempered by good judgment. He also had a big heart. Fine, he was a decent guy. He just wasn't my guy. He'd make some woman a fabulous boyfriend. Maybe. A long time from now, and after he'd forgiven himself for a past that had happened centuries before I was born. I shook my head. Not my problem anymore. Ben, on the other hand, I gave him a cheery smile. "We're keeping your brain in one piece. Have no doubt. But now we have an actual plan to do it." Chapter 11. The Mistress Did It. By my calculations, we were minutes from Brooke's house. I was driving, of course. No way I'd let Alex. He drove like a teenage boy behind the wheel of his first rebuilt Corvette, and I'd swear my Civic used to pick up extra creaks, groans, and rattles every time he drove it. We could have taken Alex's car, but then he'd be driving, and I'd be riding with my eyes closed and a death grip on the seat. I was starting to regret that decision. A dull throb beat behind my right eye. With me occupied driving, Ben and Alex had been left to their own devices. Who'd have thought two supposedly grown men could bicker so well, and so long? They might disagree with my characterization, but it was absolutely bickering. Like two siblings trapped in a small car together for a lengthy road trip. And they weren't even sitting together. Ben was in the front seat, Alex in the back. Can you guys drop the whole memory wipe debate? When I didn't hear an immediate and unconditional agreement, I raised my voice and snapped. Seriously, stop! They made grumbly, discontented noises, but then they shushed. Ben, long story short, the society isn't keen on making any kind of sweeping change, especially at a speed faster than a snail's pace. And Alex, you'd argue till you turn blue too if you thought your memory was going to be wiped. Except for a few moments in Alex's past that he'd love to not remember. But that was something I would never bring up in mixed company. On second thought, not something I'd bring up, period. Which went right back to one of the many reasons Alex and I never had a chance. An inability to be totally vulnerable to the other person. Poor communication was the cherry on top of that sad Sunday. A mile ticked by in silence. In case you were wondering, Alex said, Richard's a vamp. Huh. I've never had a hard time spotting a vampire. If something's off, look for the enchantment. Alex frowned at me in the rearview mirror. How long have you been a witch? It sounded mean, the constant picking and poking, but Alex's comments came from what he thought was a good place. Per him, I could be an amazing witch if I just pick up my training a notch and get a new mentor. He really wasn't fond of Camille. But I wasn't always sure I wanted to be an amazing witch. Camille was a competent witch, and a heck of a lot happier than some of the bigger, badder names in the biz. Glancing in the mirror, I said, I've been a witch for 10 years, as you well know. That's nothing compared to how long you've been fiddling with magic. So shut it. Alex didn't look put out. Why would he? He'd made his point. Ben turned all the way around in his seat to look Alex square in the face. Vampires are a thing? Neither of us replied. Ben turned to me and said, Vampires can do magic? And there was that nasty throb behind my right eye again. Not like you mean. Richard purchased a charm of some sort to mask his true nature. I looked in the mirror and narrowed my eyes at Alex. Yes, Alex. Probably from a witch. You don't practice enough. Alex pointed to a large house on the right. That's Brooke's house. Who's placing bets the Mistress is the killer? I perked up. Solving a murder was so much better than dissecting my faults. Murder is usually about money or love, right? I pulled into the drive. The butler, P.A., doesn't have either of those motives that we know. But the wife might have both. Although I'm not feeling the love for Lydia as the killer. I don't doubt she could do it, but she seemed legitimately upset about losing the father of her theoretical child. And I have to say that if I were guilty of killing my spouse, I'd make more of a fuss over his death than the loss of his sperm, or whatever she needs from him to procreate. I put the car in park, then glanced at the guys. Ben looked wide-eyed, and Alex was grinning. What? Don't tell me you both weren't thinking the same thing. Alex shrugged. Ben opened his mouth, shut it, then just shook his head. So is that a yes or a no on the Mistress? Alex asked. She's looking pretty promising from the love or money angle. I glanced at the spacious home on our left. Mistress implies financial support, right? So who's paying for the house? How does Chalmers' death affect Brooke financially? And love? Ben asked. I paused with my hand on the car door handle. Ah, awkward. My suburban background was leaking into my witch life yet again. Sex didn't necessarily lead to an emotional connection, and golems were particularly pragmatic in those matters. How about we leave that one open until we meet Brooke? If my ears didn't deceive me, Alex was snickering as we exited the car. He knew me too well. 3 women, 1 man. I couldn't imagine how there wouldn't be emotional conflict of some kind. I slammed the Civic's creaky door. You know what? Yes. If you guys can vote for an imaginary butler, then I'm saying yes on the very real Mistress. Usual stakes? Alex leaned against the Civic and cocked his head. I hesitated, not because I didn't like a little side bet, but because I was pinching my pennies these days. In deference to your obviously straitened circumstances, moonlighting for extra cash as you are, I'll put up my usual against one favor. I wasn't terribly invested in Brooke as the murderer. I hadn't even met the woman yet, but I could use the cash if it happened to be her. The usual was enough for a deposit on a new place. And one favor, it was a reasonable offer. I get veto power, and you know I'll use it responsibly, so don't even argue. I raised my eyebrows. Deal? Deal. He pushed away from the car and dusted his hands off. Let's do this. Ben walked around the car to join Alex and me. Same plan as before? Yeah. Alex looked over his shoulder as he walked to the front door. Speak only when you're asked a direct question. Otherwise, I'll deal with her. I don't know Brooke personally. She's new to the area. But I do know that she's a vampire. Probably a tidbit Alex could have mentioned after the meeting, since Ben went a few shades paler. On a red-headed guy, the result was a startling white. I pulled Ben by the arm. It's fine. Their eating habits are pretty civilized these days. Mostly, Alex said, before he knocked briskly on the door. I tightened my grip on Ben's arm and shot Alex a nasty look as I came to a halt next to him. His sense of humor could use some improvement. Though he wasn't wrong. Chapter 12. Dancing with a Devilish Vamp. Ben managed to pull himself together pretty quickly. By the time a woman opened the door, he was only a little pasty under his freckles. The wide-eyed brunette who stood in the doorway looked more like a librarian than a mistress or a vamp. She was pretty, but in no way overtly sexual. Conservative clothes, comfortable but not unfashionable shoes, tortoiseshell glasses that accentuated rather than hid her eyes. Brooke wasn't anything like what I'd expected. Maybe she'd pass as the girlfriend, but the mistress? Then again, there was always the possibility she was another personal assistant. So, you're the investigation team. Richard rang and said you'd be over shortly. I'm Brooke Sanders. Robert's... She paused, and her eyes crinkled at the corners. Friend. Labels, stereotyping in general, might be a problem for me. My disbelief clung tightly, even in the face of her declaration. I'd give it some more thought when I wasn't face to face with a dimpled, smiling, wannabe librarian mistress. A decidedly cheery, not remotely mournful, librarian mistress. Since you've spoken with Richard, Alex said, and you're aware of Robert's recent death, perhaps you wouldn't mind answering some questions. She swung the door wide, then disappeared into the house. Alex didn't hesitate to follow, but Ben leaned close and whispered, Vampires can only come inside a house where they've been invited, right? Myth, Brooke called out from the back of the house. They have excellent hearing, Maybe I should have mentioned that earlier. Then again, I hadn't known Brooke was a vamp, so it hadn't been relevant. I apologized because it seemed the right thing to do, and Alex wasn't about to, then said, "Would you rather wait in the car?" Ben shook his head and marched his very pasty self into Brooke's house. If something happened to Ben, I would never forgive myself. I'd known him just over 24 hours, and I was already getting attached. I blamed our brief but intense connection on when I'd used my witch side on him. Alex wasn't wrong that my studies could use a little more focus. I shook my head and followed behind Ben. As we walked through the house, I couldn't help thinking Brooke's taste was oddly similar to my grandmother's. Too much stuff, crammed into too small a space. Well-dusted figurines lined up on shelves, pictures covering the walls from chest height to just shy of the ceiling, and far too much furniture for the square footage. Just like Grandma's place. I could almost smell lavender water, her favorite scent. I urged Ben to a quicker pace. As big as the house was, I felt like I was in a tiny, poorly ventilated closet. After a short, but much too long, jaunt, we found Alex and Brooke in the kitchen. In contrast to the rest of the house, the kitchen was sparse. The counters were clear of clutter, and the sun shone brightest in this room. A kettle whistled softly. "Tea?" Brooke shut off the burner and then opened a cabinet full of tea tins. "Or coffee?" Alex declined. I shook my head, and Ben just stood there looking a little like a mouse caught in a corner by a very watchful cat. I nudged him, and he blinked, then shook his head. "What did Richard tell you?" Alex's gaze followed Brooke as she fixed a cup of tea. Ben and I were left to stand awkwardly on the fringes of the kitchen. Not cool. I pulled out a chair and sat down, uninvited, at the kitchen table. When Ben shot me a worried look, I shrugged. "Have a seat. Kowalski, isn't it?" Brooke flashed way too many teeth at him, displaying a beautiful, completely fang-free smile. Ben's eyes narrowed. He eventually joined me at the kitchen table, but not until he'd held Brooke's gaze for just long enough to say, "I know what you're playing at, lady." It seemed he didn't like to be taunted. Not bad for a guy who'd just learned about vamps. Maybe even a little daring. Brooke joined us at the kitchen table with her tea. "I know Robert died in a suspicious manner, and I know you bunch are looking into it." She pinned first me, then Ben, with a sharp look. "Except you two aren't exactly society enforcers." "And a burial?" Her gaze drifted back to Ben, where it lingered. "How interesting. And on top of what's already been done to the remains, I'm surprised you made it out of Lydia's house in one piece." Ben did an excellent job of not speaking. He didn't utter a peep. Better than I'd do if someone accused me of professional incompetence. And that was the second time the alteration of Robert's corpse had come up. Lydia had asked, and not only was Brooke now bringing it up, but someone, P.A. Richard, had obviously thought it important enough to mention to her. Lydia had concerns about the handling of Robert's body, but Mr. Kowalski was only fulfilling what he believed to be the wishes of both the deceased and his loved ones. Since Alex was hardly one to explain himself, and definitely not the sort to defend a third party, especially to a suspect, he had to be using that tidbit to elicit information. Or maybe he just liked Ben. Nah. Well, his intentions are hardly relevant. Brooke's gaze flitted from one of us to the next until she rounded the table. "You don't know, do you? Lydia's been after Robert for a child for decades. She'd finally convinced him to give up the goods. And now this." Alex narrowed his eyes. "You're saying it's possible to retrieve enough material to create a child after death?" "Certainly not when the body's been embalmed," Brooke shrugged. "But for the embalming, I'm sure she'd have tried." The woman is desperate for a child. Just look at the way she treats that assistant of hers. Like a highly paid servant? But I quickly quashed the uncharitable thought. Lydia had shown some small amount of warmth toward Richard. Since golems were known for being emotionally distant, and Lydia had the appearance of being especially so, the brief display had been noteworthy. "Do you know if Robert left for his trip?" Alex asked. Yes. Richard mentioned you'd be asking. And no, I haven't a clue. I'm not his keeper, and I wouldn't expect him to check in before he boarded or when he arrived. I doubt he even does that with his love muffin." "Love muffin?" Alex asked, with a carefully controlled expression. Even so, I had to bite the inside of my lip to keep a massive grin from spreading across my face. Alex Valois was the last man on the planet I'd expect to utter those words. Brooke grinned, again flashing a broader smile than any vamp should. "That's his darling Abby. She adores it, as if being named after a pastry is somehow endearing." I shot Ben a discreet look, but he seemed to be handling sustained proximity to his first vampire and all those flashing teeth reasonably well. He certainly wasn't as pasty as he'd been when we'd arrived. "Did you know about his trip?" Alex asked. "Of course." Brooke ran her finger along the edge of her teacup, and her eyes crinkled in genuine amusement. "He came by for a little fun the night before, which he frequently did before traveling more than a few days. Now that I'll miss." "But not the man?" The question slipped past my lips. Goth girl finally speaks. "No, Star, I certainly will not miss the man. Robert and I shared a mutual desire to regularly scratch a particular itch. No more. No love lost, but that was hardly reason to kill a man, though she certainly could have damaged his tattoos after they'd had sex. Could those small slices have been made with vamp fangs? You're not going to ask who I think is responsible for his death?" Brooke removed her glasses, and her entire demeanor shifted subtly, as if removing the glasses meant she was no longer the playful, sexy librarian. Of course they were a prop. Foolish of me not to realize immediately. I'd yet to meet a vamp that didn't have exceptional sight. Alex leaned back in his chair and crossed his arms. "Would you tell me if I did?" "Probably not." She twirled her glasses. "But it wasn't me. No Robert. No fabulous sex. Everything they say about golem men is absolutely true. Oh, and no more shares in his lovely company. He's so sentimental." She winked at me. "Every anniversary I get a nice little pile of stocks." I checked my watch, more for a place to look than anything else, but it was later than I'd realized. We still had to pick up supplies before we hit Camille's place at midnight. Alex stood up. "If you think of anything else that might be helpful, you know how to contact me." Brooke didn't bother to stand. She leaned back in her chair and delivered a sultry look aimed at Alex. "If I do call, you can be sure it will be about something much more interesting than Robert's death." Once the three of us were outside, the door closed behind us. Ben said to Alex, "Please don't tell me she was hitting on you 2 seconds after finding out her lover was murdered." I hooked my arm through Ben's as we walked to the car. "Here's the thing about Alex, Ben. Everyone hits on him." In fact, I was surprised that Brooke waited until the interview was over. There'd clearly been no love lost between her and the deceased. "Everyone?" Ben let me tug him toward the car. "Let's just say I'm surprised you haven't already." I patted his arm, then climbed into the driver's seat. "You guys ready to do some late-night grocery shopping? We need some fake dead people ingredients." Chapter 13. Cooking up a corpse. "That does not smell like a dead person. That smells like bread." Alex looked appalled by the admission, and I was disturbed by the fact that he wasn't wrong. "Wait for it." Camille glanced at her watch. Any minute now. She walked to the stove and wafted some of the venting hot air toward her. From the expression on her face, I figured the smell wasn't pleasant. Then it hit me. A sickly, sweet smell that bore no resemblance to baking bread. Oh. Ben's face took on a pinched, pained look. I know that odor. Camille flipped on the vents and started rummaging in her cupboards. She pulled out a small tub of vapor rub and chucked it at me. I'll get some candles going. Why don't you guys wait outside for the rest of the baking cycle? The odor dies down once it's done. Who would have thought the handful of ingredients we'd picked up earlier could smell like baking bread or decomposition? That was the beauty, or in this case, the odoriferous wonder, of magic. My nose hairs curled with my disgust, so I followed Camille's advice and went outside. The guys were about a split second behind me. Even in the yard I could smell it, probably because those scent molecules were clinging to the inside of my nose. Without dwelling on the disgusting concept too long, I dabbed a little vapor rub under my nose. Ben caught the small tub I'd lobbed. I'm surprised the neighbors haven't complained if this kind of thing happens often. When he was done, he offered it to Alex. Alex declined. I suspect it's not normally a problem. In my experience, most concoctions aren't quite so noxious. We have a few more minutes, so how about a recap? I let myself fall down onto my favorite squishy lounger. Pros and cons of each of our suspects. Okay. Alex pulled 2 deck chairs close, then sat down in one. Since we've only got 3 reasonable suspects so far, we can start with them. Lydia, Richard, and Brooke. Ben looked intrigued. He planted himself in the second chair and said, Does Lydia inherit her husband's wealth? Is there any way we can check on that? I swallowed a smile when he said we. Ben was well and truly hooked on solving Chalmers' murder. In no way was untangling the details behind a client's death part of even the best funeral home services. Alex didn't seem to notice my bemusement. We'll have a look at the will tomorrow, but I suspect you're right. It would be typical for the other women to get substantial single payouts, but the surviving spouse should receive the bulk of the estate. Right. So Lydia likely benefits financially, but also she loses the immediate ability to conceive. Ben frowned. Or whatever golems do to create children. That's murky, Alex said. I can tell you it takes time, requires each parent to make a magical contribution, and it's difficult. The number of children in golem families is always small. Well, Lydia didn't seem to be hurting financially, and we saw ourselves how much she wants a child. Ben leaned back in his chair and propped an ankle on his knee. I say we put her on the back burner for now. There hadn't been an opportunity for him to change, but he'd removed his jacket and tie and unbuttoned the top 2 buttons of his shirt. He looked more comfortable in his skin than he had earlier, which was an odd thought, because he'd looked perfectly at ease in a suit yesterday, and slacks and a sports coat earlier today. He wasn't one of those guys who looked half-strangled in a tie. Interestingly, Alex said, Brooke brought it up as well. When I blinked in confusion, Alex added, Lydia's desire for a child? Then his eyes got all crinkly at the corners. He was definitely laughing at me. You tired, Star? You seem a little distracted. He glanced at Ben. The jerk knew where my mind had wandered. I don't know how, just that he did. I shot him a warning look. He certainly didn't harbor any lingering romantic feelings for me, but he wasn't opposed to making me squirm over another guy. All of Alex's baggage predated me. There was 0 doubt in my mind that he held any sort of torch for me. Sticking to the more interesting subject of murder, I said, let's keep Lydia on the list for now. Just until we confirm she's as filthy rich without her husband's estate as she appears. I crossed my ankles and tipped my head back. What about Richard? Maybe he was jealous of Lydia's relationship with her husband. He seems weirdly protective for a vamp. I thought vamps were supposed to be sociopaths. Ben choked. After Ben finished his coughing fit, Alex said, "Not necessarily. I know at least one who is intermittently pretty cool." Turning to Ben, he added, "But generally, vamps are to be avoided." "No problem." The words came out a little wheezy, because Ben was still catching his breath. The transformation alters brain chemistry or rewires the brain in some way. I've never met a vamp who wasn't significantly different post-transformation. I sat up enough to look Ben in the eye. Just to be clear, that doesn't happen with witches. We go in human, we come out just the same, just with more magic. No blood drinking and no scrambled personalities. "So you say," Alex muttered. I was about to lob an energy ball when the back door clicked shut and Camille joined us. "Shame on you, Alex. You know perfectly well that a witch's transformation doesn't alter her personality one iota." She made a disappointed tisking noise at him. "You're just trying to push Star's buttons." But I didn't get off scot-free. She turned and pointed. "And you. Don't think I didn't see that pink glow. No throwing energy balls in the backyard." I felt a wee bit mothered, and not in the warm, fuzzy way. I probably deserved to be grounded, since Alex could make me act like a teenager. Not sure what his excuse was, since he was way, way older than me. Alex hopped to his feet and pulled up another chair. "Our corpse is done, I presume?" She settled into her chair. "It's cooling. We need only assemble the pieces and cast a binding spell on it so it doesn't come apart before the ceremony. Is this an open casket affair, Ben?" Yes." Such a shame the service had already been announced. Otherwise, we could have quietly made it all disappear. No baking up corpses in the middle of the night. No sham services. Ben looked uncomfortable with the idea, but didn't protest. I didn't see how he could. He'd met the widow, and he knew the public ceremony hadn't been the wishes of the deceased or his family. "Should we be talking about," he lowered his voice, "witches, vampires, corpses, that sort of thing, in your backyard?" Camille's laugh carried through the backyard, but only so far as the protection she'd laid out, no farther. "We can speak openly," I said. "There are protections all along the fence line to prevent any kind of eavesdropping." I crossed my arms behind my head. But back to our suspect list. I say Richard stays on the list just because he's weird. Vamps don't usually work for golems, do they? "Since vamps have oversized egos," Alex said, "they don't usually work for anyone but themselves, if they have a choice." "Ah, he's not broke." All three of us turned to Camille, and she smiled. "I have sources, too. Richard Fox had money as a human, and he's hardly broke now, even by vamp standards." "Then it's definitely odd that he's working for a golem," Alex said. Ben settled back into his chair, his concern over vampires and nosy neighbors apparently allayed. "And weird that he's a PA. You said vamps had oversized egos, which seems like a bad thing for an assistant. You can't get much lower on the totem pole than a PA, in my experience. Any chance there's something between Lydia and Richard?" That's an odd match. I couldn't recall the exact dynamic between the two, but I don't think they're lovers. "No. Give me a second." Alex leaned forward and rested his forearms on his thighs. I'd forgotten how he did that. Pulled up memories like they were filed away in a drawer. He was more like a puppy than a lover. And she... He looked up, and I saw a glint of satisfaction. And just a split second later, I got it. "Oh no, that's messed up." Ben looked back and forth between us. "How about you fill in the rest of the crowd?" Motherly. Lydia was motherly. Not in the human sense, but for a golem. The icy, cold, controlled woman we met didn't blink at her husband's death, was only put out by the inaccessibility of his baby-making juice, and only showed warmth for one person during our meeting. Her assistant. I shook my head. Not that I can blame her with a husband like this Robert guy. I felt a twinge of conscience for speaking ill of a dead man, but holding out on creating a little golem kid, the one thing Lydia actually wanted, and that on top of his women on the side. Yeah, the dead guy wasn't leaving me with much to admire. I can't say I saw that. Ben paused, then asked Camille, "What do you know about Richard's life before he was turned? You said he had money?" "Ah, yes. He was a trust fund kid. Oil money, I think. His parents died shortly after his transformation, and he inherited their estate." Alex frowned. "Wait, you're saying he's still living under his original identity?" Camille nodded. "He was turned about 5 years ago, when you were off on one of your European jaunts. He's kept a low profile since." Alex unclipped his cell from his belt and flipped it open and then shut. "No signal. Can I use your phone?" Camille gestured at the house. "In the kitchen." Alex excused himself. After about 5 seconds of perplexed silence, Ben said, "I don't get it. He was on the list primarily due to proximity. He knew Chalmers' plans, had intimate access to the family. But what does he gain by Chalmers' death?" "Revenge?" But as I said it, it didn't feel right. "Not on Lydia's behalf," Camille said firmly. "Except for Alex's friend Wembley, I've never met a vamp who acted out of anything other than self-interest." "Yeah, makes sense, since they have the reputation of a bunch of sociopaths. There's a reason people don't like vampires. Not that I'd met a large number of them, but the ones I had hardly left a positive impression." Ben gave me a funny look. "What?" I reviewed what I'd said. "Oh, well, there's a reason we don't like them besides the blood drinking, obviously. Except everyone had to eat, right?" That thought I kept to myself. Ben was doing really well with the idea of witches and wizards. No reason to overload the poor guy. Maybe I needed this job at the funeral home more than I realized. It was possible I was losing touch with normal people. It's not like I spent much time at home with my mom, and the few friends I had were all witches and wizards. Alex returned from inside with a curiously blank expression. I knew that look. Whatever he'd learned from the phone call he'd just made, it wasn't good. Richard killed his parents. Definitely not good. He dropped into his chair with loose-limbed ease, but I could see the telltale signs of the stress, no, the anger, that he was trying to hide. The fine lines around his eyes deepened, and his jaw firmed when he was upset. "Apparently, the rumor flourished while I was away, but died before I got back in the country." "You are certain?" Ben asked. A small muscle ticked in Alex's jaw. "Cornelius said it's a quietly acknowledged fact." "Cornelius is Alex's boss," I told Ben, in case he'd forgotten. Ben looked appalled. "If you're all so sure, why is this guy not locked up? How can he walk around like he's done nothing wrong?" I bit my lip. Hard. Sometimes I got a sick feeling in the pit of my stomach that I'd made the wrong choice all those years ago. I'd only been 15 when I'd chosen a path that would alter my life forever. Becoming a witch was a process, but once completed, I'd been transformed. There was no going back. And sometimes, like right now when I was faced with the harsh reality of my choice, I wanted to pummel something. I'd tried kickboxing, but it just made my neck hurt and gave me migraines. Maybe I could pummel Richard. Even with these flashes of uncertainty that I occasionally got, in my heart of hearts, I knew I'd made the right choice. I hadn't been born a witch. Magic had chosen me, and I accepted the transformation. I'd been made. That was what they called it. Made versus born. But I'd always had the spark of magic inside me, and I'd be miserable without an outlet for my talent. But there were days when living within this hidden world, with its skewed priorities and wretched sense of justice, twisted me into knots. Alex reached down and clasped the hand I'd clenched above my midsection. "We'll fix this." He squeezed my fingers and then let go. Turning to Ben, he said, "Enough. We'll make this right. But you have to understand there are some things we don't have control over. It's just the way it is, and change comes slowly." Ben blew out a long breath. "Yeah." He caught my eye. "I'm sorry. How can I help?" I turned to sit crosswise on the lounger so that I was facing the group. "We need evidence. Or we kill him." Alex spoke as if those words didn't carry any special weight or meaning. A dead Richard Fox sounded pretty appealing right now, but I couldn't put that kind of burden on Alex. I knew what kind of demons, what kind of guilt he wrestled with on a daily basis. "No. We build a case and we pitch it to Cornelius." Camille sat up straighter. "Lydia, she's your case. With her connections, she is a golem after all. She's perfect. She wanted a child from her husband, and someone took that away from her. Convince Lydia that Richard was out to steal her child, and she'll pitch holy hell to see him pay for her husband's death." Ben held up his hand. "I get that there's evidence, somewhere out there, that Richard killed his parents, and if he killed once, he's more likely to kill again. But he had a clear financial motive before. What's his motive for killing Robert Chalmers?" Camille, Alex, and I shared a look. It had been obvious to us, so obvious that I started to wonder how Lydia could be so blind as to not see it. But unlike Ben, I'd been living in this world for almost 10 years. I knew more about how the enhanced community thought and acted. Richard was protecting his relationship with Lydia. As the words left my mouth, the nasty knot in my stomach tightened. Normal people had arguments, disinherited family, refused communication with friends, maybe even slugged someone they were hacked off at. Normal people didn't murder other people. Then again, Richard wasn't exactly a person, normal or otherwise. Protecting his relationship with Lydia from what? Ben looked genuinely confused. Until he didn't. Suddenly he looked appalled. "Wait, you're thinking that he made sure the body would be embalmed so Lydia couldn't retrieve whatever she needed to have a child?" Alex nodded, and Camille said, "You've got it." "That makes no sense. Why not just cremate him if that's the case?" Camille and Alex shared a look. "What?" I asked. "That actually seems like a good question." "No greater insult than for the remains to be buried," Camille said. Alex inclined his head. "Except to be embalmed and then buried." Spite? No one's ego was that big, except I was clearly wrong and someone's was. "That's insane." Ben choked. "And killing someone isn't? Also, how does a child play into all this? How could a child hurt Richard's relationship with Lydia?" Ben blinked. "You weren't kidding with the sociopath thing, were you?" "Not kidding," Alex said. "I think you're right, Camille. With Lydia's influence behind an accusation, I should be able to get Cornelius on board. And with Cornelius on board, we can get a witch-supervised confession." I cringed at what that meant. Some witch trawling around in the nasty goop of Richard's twisted head and turning the mental thumbscrews until he confessed. Then the weight of that confession weighed as truth or lie by that same witch. All I could think was, not it. And Alex wondered why I didn't want to work for the society. Yuck. "We'll need some kind of evidence, but that wouldn't go far without Lydia's support." Alex paused, then said, "You know, killing him would be easier." Camille sighed. "It really would. But that just won't do. You want change. This is how you get it. It has to start somewhere, so we started here." I nodded. "And now?" Alex nodded. He looked more resigned than hopeful, but he'd had a lot of the idealism beaten out of him over the years. What was my excuse? Camille stood up. "I need a drink. Anyone else?" On that, we were enthusiastically, unanimously in agreement. Chapter 14. That voodoo that you do, that isn't voodoo. Funny how, in a stressful situation, booze could unite all sides. Alex, Camille, Ben, and I filed into the house in search of wine, or tequila, and found something else entirely. Baked goods of the very inedible variety. Not that we'd forgotten about the cooling body parts. We'd just let other concerns take over for a moment. Camille's lace tablecloth made a particularly disturbing backdrop for the haphazard display of arms, legs, feet, and other parts that she'd left cooling on racks. They all had the color of cooked dough, but the shape of very real human body parts. It was disconcerting, to say the least. Too late, I recalled that Ben might be particularly disturbed by the sight. I turned to him, expecting the pasty complexion I'd seen when he learned about vampires, but he looked fine. Better than fine. His eyes were wide with wonder. "This is amazing. They're so realistic." Ben reached out a hand, then stopped himself. "Can I touch them?" "Absolutely." Camille beamed at him. "When we're done, you won't be able to tell the difference between the fake Chalmers and the real one." "Wow. Does this type of work have any medical applications? Prosthesis, for example?" I shook my head and wandered over to the bar, leaving Camille to explain the magical facts of life to him. Tequila was calling my name. I could handle a few shots without deleterious effect, and wine just wasn't gonna cut it. "I like him," Alex said softly from just behind my right shoulder. "He's my boss, Alex. He's barely that. I've worked for Kowalski's funeral home less than a day, and I'm pretty sure it won't be much longer. Seriously, would you keep me on after this?" I poured myself a shot of tequila and threw it back in one swallow. With a little gasp, I said, "Good stuff." "You're working on the assumption he'll remember any of this." He lifted an eyebrow when I poured another shot. I rolled my eyes and filled a second shot glass. Handing him the glass, I said, "Prost." We clinked glasses and down the second, or third, best tequila I'd ever had. "Hey now," Camille hollered. "Take it easy. That's the good stuff. Pour me a shot before you drink it all." Ben eyed us all like we were crazy. "I didn't know there was good stuff tequila." He declined when I offered to pour him a shot. "Maybe you guys can clue me in on the plan while we assemble the fake Mr. Chalmers." "We have a plan?" I tipped my glass at him and tossed back another shot. "I'm thinking yes. Now you just need to clue in the new guy." Alex lifted his glass to Ben. "And that, Star, is why I like this guy." Alex took a sip. How he could sip tequila I'd never understand. Then said, "I do have a plan. First, we verify that Abby wasn't involved. I think we can use her help." Hands on her hips, Camille said, "No. First thing we do is assemble the fake Mr. Chalmers and get him out of my house. I don't want my neighbors stumbling on the human meat feast we've got going on here." Wow, she was right. Laid out on the table, on drying racks that could equally be viewed as bizarre serving trays, were hunks of... Nope. I nudged thoughts of cannibalism aside. I think she has a point. There's a creep-tastic factor here that wouldn't go over well with outsiders. Let's get this corpse built. An hour later, all the pieces seemed to be in place, each connected by a minor binding spell. What looked like a doughy outline of a man rested on Camille's dining table. "So, how do we animate him?" At Ben's worried look, I added, I mean, make him look fully human. That's the trickiest part, Camille said, after mixing the dough. She retrieved a few supplies from her pre-mixed potions cupboard, which was one of several reasons Alex kept harping on me to find a new mentor. The more powerful the witch, the less prep work and paraphernalia was required for any particular task. Camille leaned heavily on potions that she spent a lot of time and energy preparing in advance. She was effective and loved what she did, but she didn't have the sheer wattage of some other witches in the area. And I didn't regret my choice for an instant. Camille flashed one of the vials at me before placing it on the counter, and a laugh burbled up in my chest. I remember that one. Camille fetched a few more small bottles, explaining as she lined them up. Star accidentally inhaled some of the fumes. She shook a finger at me. After I warned you twice. You did. Ben eyed me suspiciously. So, what happened? Everything turned purple. I twisted the bottle around so that he could read the label. Purple haze. Turning his incredulous gaze to Camille, he said, You have a special potion specifically for making people see purple? Camille chuckled. No, that's a side effect, but it seemed an appropriate name. And don't ask, you don't want to know what it's for. Ben inched away from the innocuous-looking blue glass bottle. Alex eyed the various bottles lined up on the counter with some doubt. 7 potions? Are these all really necessary? Do you want him to look, feel, smell, and decompose like a real person? Her motherly smile was freakishly at odds with the image of a decomposing Robert Chalmers. Alex lifted his hands. You're the expert. She raised her eyebrows and shot him a mildly amused look. Step back, unless you'd like to be seeing purple. Or worse. Alex, Ben, and I all took a big step back from the dough corpse on the table. Lips twitching, Camille started sprinkling the figure with a few drops from each of the bottles. I focused on the body using my magical sight, but didn't see anything until the last 2 potions. First, the body glowed with a mellow amber light, the color of Camille's magic. Then, when she added the last potion, the magic snapped into place. One moment a doughy bread man lay on the table, and the next, Robert Chalmers, version 2. Ben stumbled back a step. He moved. He shuffled back another foot. It moved. I swear it did. Is this like that voodoo zombie thing? Are we going to be putting an undead man in the ground? I glanced at the clock. It was 3 a.m, so I should probably cut the guy some slack. Who was I kidding? He'd discovered magic, witches, vampires, wizards, and replicated corpses in less than a day. He was doing pretty good. Camille beat me to the punch. First, voodoo isn't really what we do. Camille was all about the truth, so she added, not usually. Ben wasn't looking particularly reassured. I quickly added, it's not alive, wasn't ever alive, never will be alive, and therefore is not undead. It moved. Ben glanced at Alex. Right? It did. I gave him a sheepish look. But I promise it won't again. I might even have been telling the truth. From what I'd seen, the corpse had twitched in its first moment of pseudo-life and then fallen lifeless to the table. I glanced discreetly in Camille's direction, and she gave me a little shrug. Not helpful. After a few seconds, Ben rubbed his eyes. Right. I'm not riding in the back seat with it. Actually, any chance he'd fit in your trunk? Alex eyed the corpse and then clapped Ben on the back. We'll make it happen. Without too much fuss, Alex wrapped Chalmers 2.0 in a sheet Camille provided and threw him over his shoulder in a fireman's carry. I made Ben wait in the house until we had the body packed away in the trunk. Good thing I did. because Alex and I had to do some twisting and jamming to squish Chalmers' big body inside my Civic trunk. I had to keep reminding myself it was like a huge loaf of human-feeling bread, not an actual human. And I really didn't want to linger on what it looked like Alex and I were doing. If one of the neighbors got a good look, which they wouldn't because magic, but if they did, they'd definitely see Alex and me struggling with an uncooperative corpse wrapped in a sheet. Suburban neighbor fail. Once the trunk was firmly shut, I retrieved Ben, and the three of us set off for the funeral home. I swallowed a giggle as Camille waved goodbye from the driveway. Ben looked over his shoulder and waved back at her. I feel like I'm leaving my grands after a holiday meal. And then I did giggle, because that was exactly how I felt. Fake body in the trunk notwithstanding. I drove exactly 2 miles above the speed limit, stopped completely at all stop signs, and popped a few breath mints in case I still smelled like tequila. Not that I wouldn't pass a breathalyzer. It was incredibly difficult to intoxicate a witch with drugs or alcohol. 4 tequila shots had the same effect on me now that half a glass of wine had when I was a 15-year-old human kid. And those shots had been hours ago. But I wasn't going to give any cop running around looking to fill some traffic ticket quota an excuse to stop us. Having a corpse in the trunk, even the fake kind, was an exceptional incentive for safe and legal driving. When we arrived at the funeral home, I sent Ben ahead to unlock the door while Alex and I unstuffed fake Chalmers from the cramped confines of my trunk. The less Ben saw of me manhandling a corpse like it was no big thing, the more I could cling to the fiction that I'd still have a job when this was over. A few minutes later, and Chalmers 2.0 was stashed next to the real man in cold storage. It was eerie how alike they were. Of course, the fake version didn't have that sucking void clinging to him. Now that I knew it was there and what to look for, it was easy enough to see. We needed to get the real Chalmers disposed of quickly, because it couldn't be safe for him to linger around as he was. As we filed out of cold storage, I said, "Time to head home, to get some sleep." I turned to Ben. "And don't you have work in the morning?" Ben glanced at his watch. "You mean in 4 hours? Theoretically, but I don't have any client appointments booked until late afternoon. What about the real Robert Chalmers?" Alex pulled out his car keys. "He's fine locked in your cold storage for the night. With a good outcome on the Richard front, I suspect Mrs. Chalmers will choose to have you properly dispose of the body." Ben nodded, but he looked out of it. "Are you safe to drive?" I could easily drop him off at home. What was another hour of missed sleep in the grand scheme of things? If it meant making sure Ben arrived home safely, I'd skip out on sleep entirely. "No, I'm good. My place is just around the corner." He rubbed his eyes again, then caught my worried look. "Really, I'm fine to get home. But thank you." I nodded uncomfortably. I wasn't exactly the motherly sort, so it made me itch that I was feeling motherly. Not motherly. Protective. Ben's gaze narrowed. "I'm with you guys tomorrow, until this is cleared up." "Yeah." Alex stretched out his hand. "Good working with you today." Alex never shook hands. Most of us enhanced folks didn't. He really did like Ben. Or he was trying to get a read on him. Much more likely. Enough with the speculation. I needed to get some sleep before I could trust myself to differentiate between healthy suspicion and paranoia. I did a quick calculation. Alex always got at least 6 hours of sleep when possible, and I knew the trouble he had when he skimped. Unpleasant trouble. Potentially much worse than unpleasant. In other words, he didn't skimp when at all possible. All of which meant that we shouldn't meet until midday. "Meet at Camille's at noon?" I asked. Everyone agreed, and we went our separate ways. On the way home, I tried not to consider the fact that unless I pulled a rabbit out of a hat, today might be Ben's last day to remember magic, vampires, wizards, and witches. Chapter 15. The Plan. "Did you love him?" Alex asked from his seat at Abby's kitchen table. Except it wasn't Alex. It was some guy who looked like him. It couldn't be Alex, because the man I knew didn't talk about love. I'd never heard the word pass his lips. And this was a guy who I was pretty darn sure had loved me, insofar as he was capable. Still did, if I had to guess, just not in a romantic way. What had gotten into him? Abby, a.k.a. the girlfriend, had big doe eyes, and they were currently shining with unshed tears. "I did. I know it's ridiculous." She ran a knuckle underneath her eye. "The man was a golem." She gave Alex an exasperated look. "We all know what they're like." Alex handed her a neatly folded, pristinely white, monogrammed handkerchief. He had a serious stash of them. When I lived with him, I used to tease him about having an entire dresser drawer devoted to hankies. Neatly folded, not at all rumpled. Hankies. The man was a mystery in many ways, including his bizarre ability to maintain them in an impeccable state when the rest of his attire most closely resembled that of a college kid who'd overslept his exam. She dabbed at the corner of her eyes. "What do you need me to do?" We'd interrupted her at lunch. My first clue that she wasn't a vamp. But now, with the tears, it was doubly clear. Vamps didn't cry. Because they were sociopaths? Or because they were physically incapable? No clue. They just didn't. Vampires were weird. Abby wasn't a witch. That I could see even without my magical sight tuned to perfection. Wizard? Not that common for women to be wizards, but it happened. Alex leaned forward on the table. "We're looking for a confession." Abby pressed her lips together and shook her head. "I'm not a witch. I can't dig in his brain for the truth." I casually shifted in my seat so Ben wasn't in my peripheral vision. I had no desire to catch his response to that particular factoid. We'd been open about mind-wiping, and I'd even fessed up to having a peek inside his head. But what Abby described was so much more invasive. I didn't like the idea of him envisioning me doing that. Not that I could pick out truths from an unwilling mind. Not yet. That was all part and parcel with honing my magical sight, and I wasn't exactly practicing that skill like I ought. "We just need you to be exactly who you are. A grieving woman who's recently learned the man she loves has died," Alex said. "Right. I'm not an idiot, Alex. You want me to add a little persuasion to the mix. Am I right?" Alex's expression froze, just for a split second. Then he said, "That's up to you." If I hadn't been looking for it, I'd have missed the flash of unease. Anything that reeked of compulsion made Alex uncomfortable. And what was persuasion but a mild form of compulsion? Or so he'd said to me at some point. The mention of persuasion at least gave me a good guess as to what Abby was. A coyote. A trickster with the ability to manipulate perception in small degrees, especially when the subject wasn't expecting it. Persuasion was a little like sleight of hand. Know what to look for, and all the magic is gone. Finally, Abby said, "Okay, I'll do it." "For Robert?" She sniffed. "I swear, this is all Lydia's fault. She had more love for that kid than she ever did for Robert." "That kid? You mean Richard, her PA?" I asked. Abby looked at me like I'd sprouted a second head. "Right. That little vamp twerp who runs around chasing after her. The woman wants to be worshipped, and her little vamp servant is the closest she's going to get." She balled up Alex's handkerchief. As if Robert would ever put anyone, let alone her, on a pedestal. He wasn't that kind of guy. No, I couldn't imagine he was, not considering what I'd learned about him in the last day. "Then you'll attend the funeral?" Alex asked. "Mr. Kowalski is making the arrangements." Alex indicated Ben, and Abby's jaw dropped. "A human funeral? With the digging, and the hole in the ground, and the—" She squinted at Alex. "Have you lost your mind?" "No, not yet," Alex replied. "We won't be putting the original Chalmers in the ground." "Ah, your witch has created a replacement," Abby sniffed. "Why? Why go to the bother?" With a blandly polite look that I suspected got a lot of mileage, Ben said, "It's been scheduled and announced to friends, family, and co-workers. Canceling at this point would arouse suspicion." Ben omitted the part where he'd originally refused to consider canceling the service for ethical reasons. Before Alex and I had convinced him a golem would never consider being buried and couldn't have made the arrangements himself. Too bad, because that part sounded a little better, and it was what got us started on the doppelganger corpse path. "Family? Really?" Abby shook her head and shot Ben a look dripping with condescension. No trace of her grief remained. She was 100% mean girl now. "Give him a break," Alex said. "Once it became clear there were irregularities with the funeral arrangements." "The fact that there was a funeral at all didn't clue you in?" Abby really was embracing that mean girl persona. Alex continued. "Once we discovered the irregularities, we figured whoever had made the arrangements had something to do with Robert's death. All the more reason to allow the ceremony to go forward." Abby gave Ben a disapproving look. "You don't know who scheduled the funeral, and you own the funeral home?" I was starting to see how the dead guy and she might have been a good match. "There are extenuating circumstances," Alex said, with a twitch to his lips. "Do you want to help retrieve a confession and punish Robert's killer, or not?" From the read I was getting off this woman, no way would she miss the unfolding drama that was likely to take place at Chalmers' funeral. Yes, she genuinely cared for the man. And yes, it seemed she did want his killer caught. But she was also a bona fide mean girl in grown-up shoes. I had no doubt she'd derive real pleasure from attending the service and watching all the players of Robert Chalmers' life congregate. "Fine," she snapped. "When's the service?" "Tomorrow evening, 6:30. And as Ben gave Abby the remaining particulars, I realized how awkward a situation he was in. He was discussing the funeral service of a married man with that man's girlfriend, knowing the wife and mistress would be attending. At least if we had our way, they would be. The plan would hardly work without all the players present. Even with Ben's fair complexion, I didn't see a hint of a flush. Maybe delicate situations such as these occurred with some frequency out in Buda, Texas. Not the fake corpse part, of course, but the complex familial dynamics. It was either practice, or Ben was simply a cool, calm, and collected guy, whatever the situation. Or he was really good at faking it. Alex gave Abby a brief sketch of what to expect. We'd gather the players at the funeral, incite Richard to anger by criticizing his grand plan and motivations, push said anger to sufficient heights that he'd be incautious in what he revealed, elicit an explanation of his grand plan without triggering mass bloodshed, hope like heck that Lydia's desire for a child outweighed any loyalty she felt to her manipulative assistant, and finally, record all the above in case Lydia refused to give testimony. No one said it was a good plan. A lot of moving parts and some uncontrollable factors made it a gamble. But Alex was especially good at thinking on his feet and adjusting on the fly, and I wasn't half bad at it myself. We'd make it work. When he was done, Abby shrugged and nodded. It might work. The transformation gave him the same narcissistic bent that so many vamps have, and then add in all the weird mommy issues. Yeah. It may just work. Her words still held that mean girl bite, but her confrontational zeal had ebbed. I could see the edges of her grief pushing back again. Unlikable as she might be, she cared for Robert. She was likely the only one who had. "Can we count on you to crank up the heat? Make the first accusation?" Alex asked. "Oh, yes. I'll gladly show up and stir the pot. Lydia hates a scene, and she'll despise the fact that her darling Richard put a wrench in her plans. If she wasn't so blinded by his puppy-like adoration, she'd have seen his glaring faults and fired him long ago." She perked up just a little. "This might almost be fun. What about the normals? Wouldn't do to have anyone fall in the crossfire." That last part was delivered in a dismissive tone that made her feelings toward unenhanced humans quite clear. The little, non-magical folk were expendable, but it wouldn't do at all to risk a reveal scandal. Abby was the personification of the society's attitudes toward human life. So long as people like her were greater in number than people like Alex, Camille, and me, then changing the society's laws truly would be an uphill battle. Alex inclined his head toward Ben, who said, "The service begins at 7. Only the principals are being instructed to arrive at 6:30, including Lydia, Richard, Brooke, and yourself. We would appreciate your promptness." She gave him a cold look. "I'm sure you would." Turning a much kinder eye to Alex, she said, "And you'll make certain I'm not a casualty in your little crusade, won't you, Alex?" "I'll put in a word with Cornelius, if it comes to that." Alex was basically promising to take the blame for whatever went down at the funeral. I hadn't been giving it much thought, because unlike me, Alex had serious clout with the society. But Alex was risking repercussions. Alex, Ben, and I had been bouncing along, asking questions, poking our noses in, as if we had the society's seal of approval. But this was no official society case. Alex was freelancing. If this blew up, he could be in real trouble. I sighed. Both of us could. That was a lovely topic to stew on while I rode in the back of Alex's car and clung to the armrest for dear life. Chapter 16. The Other Plan. Alex, Ben, and I had the rest of today and tomorrow to sort out the details for the funeral. Alex had errands, whatever that meant, so he dropped Ben and me back at the funeral home with a promise to return at 9 this evening. Prep was tight, in part because Ben had been distracted from work concerns by his foray into the land of murder investigations, and also because he was technically down an assistant director, since his had retired and he hadn't yet replaced her. Tight, but doable, he assured me, as we divvied up tasks. And I would have agreed with him, up until about 3 minutes ago. Kinda hard to finish prepping for a funeral service while hunkered underneath the spare desk in the prep room, which was exactly where Ben and I currently were. Leaving didn't seem wise, since we were being shot at. Talk about sucking all of the joy out of my work. I'd constructed a shield using the existing surface of the desk as a foundation, but I hardly had experience with gunfire and sure as heck hadn't tested it in these conditions. Funny thing was that we really did have a productive afternoon. I wasn't scheduled until later in the evening, but circumstances being what they were, I figured I could volunteer my time until the official clock started for me at 7 p.m. The prep room filled with the loud report of a gun being fired indoors, deafeningly loud, as it turned out, even with the sound filter I'd wrapped around us. I reconsidered my choice to volunteer my time today. If I was being shot at, it would be cool to be paid. Then again, I suppose Ben and I were only on the wrong side of a gun because of me, so yeah, probably a bad idea to ask for my regular hourly rate, let alone hazard pay. On the bright side of this utter mess, we didn't have to worry about the original plan falling apart. It had always been a bit of a gamble, Lots of moving parts to go awry, lots of people to act in unpredictable ways. But there was unpredictable, and there was showing up at Kowalski's and opening fire on me and Ben. A bullet pinged off my makeshift shield. There was another bright side. My shield was officially battle-tested. If I were all about peddling my wares like most witches, I'd find a way to make some money out of that claim. Probably the more immediate bonus was that it happened to be keeping the sociopathic, psychotic, armed vampire from killing us. "You have a plan?" Ben crouched lower under the desk, his shoulder brushing mine. "Not get shot?" The sound of a bullet ricocheting off metal made me flinch. "He's shooting at the cold storage lock." Ben reached his arm out to point, but I smacked it. "Quit that. I don't know how far this shield extends." I'd used the desk as a foundation, and I knew it covered the entirety of the actual desk. I'd certainly attempted to extend it beyond the metal surface by several inches, but those parts were bound to be weaker. "Now you tell me?" He squished closer to me. He was a big guy, and it wasn't a huge desk. "Any chance Alex will show up early?" He was due to meet us at 9, and last I'd looked, that was over 15 minutes from now. Could be 2 minutes, could be 10. Optimistically 10. Another shot had me rubbing my ears. We really should have discussed a plan B. We, being mostly Alex, because Ben and I weren't exactly battle-seasoned. But even Alex hadn't anticipated a raid of the dang funeral home. I peeked around the edge of the desk, but ducked back when Richard pointed the gun in my direction again. "What self-respecting vampire uses a gun?" I hollered. Apparently I was angry enough to shut off all the logical parts of my brain. A sharp jab in my ribcage was quickly followed by Ben whispering, "Stop agitating the armed man. Vampire. Whatever." Since I dropped the sound filter around us to deliver my less-than-zinger-like jab, Richard heard Ben's comment as well. "That's right, Star. Stop agitating the man with the gun." Richard fired another round at the cold storage. "You could give me the combination and make this a lot easier for yourself." "So you can destroy all the evidence and then kill us? No thanks." It wasn't until I said the words out loud that I realized there was evidence. That was why the sociopath, psychopath PA was here. The original body held some clue that we'd missed. My full mental effort had been focused on remaining calm, not getting killed, and keeping Ben safe. I hadn't been thinking in terms of Richard's motivation, but why else chance this break-in? Another 2 ricocheting shots had more than my ears ringing this time. My brain felt like it was turning into mush inside my skull. I popped the sound filter back up. We needed a plan. We could hang out while Richard blew a hole in the cold storage door, but then he'd be after us. Alex might show up by then. Richard didn't know to hurry because he didn't know Alex was meeting us in a few minutes. But what if Alex was late? "I'm getting a mobile phone," I muttered. Ben shot me a concerned look. "Sorry. It's just come up a lot lately. Seems to solve a lot of problems." "But since we don't have one..." "We could make a run for it, but I'd have to construct a much less reliable shield. I wasn't interested in taking that kind of chance, especially since maintaining any sort of protection while moving would be extremely difficult. I honestly wasn't sure I was up to it. From what I'd seen, Richard didn't have vamp speed. He was a baby vamp, so that wasn't surprising. But I'd been squatting under the desk long enough that one of my feet was falling asleep, and the Doc Martens wouldn't help with speed. Ben? Ben might be fast. It was hard to say. But really, that was moot without a workable shield. Ben poked me. "Ow! Stop it. I'm thinking." Actually, I was done thinking. I only had one real option. Magic. Small problem. I'd never actually hurt someone with magic. "Think faster." Mentoring with Camille meant I was pretty strong in potions, charms, and chants, but those all required prep time I didn't have. And Richard just kept firing. Maybe I should have counted, except I had no clue how many rounds his semi-automatic held, so it didn't matter. Besides, he seemed like a prepared sort of psychopath. He probably brought extra clips.
Seriously, faster would be good. Can't you zap him with one of those magic balls?
Since I'd never tried to do more than singe with one, I hadn't a clue. Yeah, absolutely. Maybe it was lying, or the flying bullets, but I was feeling a little lightheaded, very scattered. Neither was good for focused magic. I leaned close to Ben. He was here, and I needed to ground myself quickly. And I kissed him. It was an impulse, and my brain was mush from the stress. But it worked. I focused on his lips touching mine, and nothing else, until I felt the hum of magic pushing at the periphery of my awareness. I placed my palm on his chest. Stay here. I took that zing of magic I'd found and molded it into a ball. Here was the trick. As I shaped it and bent it to my will, I let the fear and the anger I'd been hiding behind a false sense of calm seep into the small ball. And then I let it fly. The room shuddered. Debris flew. Smoke rose. A mini war zone created with a single burst of pissed-off witch magic. I exhaled. A mess of dust and plaster was barely discernible through the smoke. Looked like I had a lot of anger and a good amount of fear locked up inside me. More than was generated by today's confrontation. A lot of carefully buried emotions had been unearthed as I'd yanked them into the grenade of magic and angst I'd constructed. No need for anyone to know how I drummed up that much juice on short notice. The buried emotions and the kiss were tidbits I'd keep to myself. I would, however, be mentioning my exceptional aim. I touched my ears. They were still faintly ringing. And Ben. I turned to make sure he'd stayed behind the desk and my shield where I'd left him. He looked unharmed, but he'd emerged and was surveying his prep room. He was covering his mouth to keep the plaster dust out. That was how bad it was. Wild guess? His insurance didn't cover acts of magic. Unemployment, here I come. At least I had my under-the-table witch gig at Camille's store. It wouldn't pay for a new apartment, but I wasn't about to starve any time soon. I rubbed the grit out of my eyes and inspected the room. The cold storage looked intact. Bonus, I hadn't blown up what might turn out to be our only evidence, especially if I had blown up our killer PA. Oops, I whispered, but Ben wasn't looking at me and didn't turn at the sound of my voice. The poor guy. From the look on his face, he was thinking about insurance too. Then he said something, gave me a concerned look, and pointed, emphatically. I turned back to find the smoke haze gone and Richard intact, passed out cold, maybe dead, but definitely in one piece. He twitched. Not dead then. Another energy ball? But maybe this time with fewer repressed emotions fueling it. I'd hate to accidentally burn down the entire backside of the building. Alex stepped into my line of sight just in time, as I was having the inconvenient realization that I couldn't zap an already unconscious man, even to keep him incapacitated and therefore not attempting to kill us. An extremely inconvenient realization. About time, I said. Alex winced as he held up a hand. I took that to mean stop, and by the peeved expression, maybe something like, "Stop with the energy balls already." "Is he all right?" I asked, pointing at Richard. Alex paused over Richard's body, his once more very still body. My stomach roiled. What did I care if the guy was dead? He was probably getting hung in the next day or two anyway. My hand drifted to cover my midsection, and I had to take a few breaths to quell the nausea. Dead by me was different from dead by someone else. At least my stomach thought so. Alex turned away from the body and mouthed something. I shrugged. "I can't hear you." Alex closed his eyes with a pained expression, so I turned to Ben. He lifted his finger to his lips, at which point the light bulb came on. I finally noticed the roar of silence in my ears. It was the blood-rushing shush of nothing. The ringing in my ears had faded, but so had my hearing, and I hadn't even noticed. I must have been yelling my head off. I turned my back on Ben, Alex, and possibly dead Richard. I needed to focus. Most witches could speed minor healing. I thought I could do it, if the damage to my hearing wasn't too severe, and I remembered how to do it, though it had been a while since I'd tried. I stilled my thoughts, focused, thought pleasant, fluffy, healing thoughts, and got a big bunch of nothing. Worst witch ever. Ben popped up in my peripheral vision holding some brightly colored scrap of paper. He held it out to me. When I saw what it was, I couldn't help laughing. It looked like a tiny temporary tattoo of a skull and crossbones, the traditional label for poison, but in reality was a healing potion. I'd impregnated the paper with a nifty little potion I'd learned from Camille. Bright pink, because I thought that color would most offend the macho wizard I'd thought Alex was. But he just smiled one of his oh-so-rare smiles and thanked me. Since it had been a gift when we'd first been an item, before we'd even moved in together, he'd been carrying it around in his wallet a long time. Maybe there was a sentimental bone or two in him after all. I took it from Ben, licked the paper, and stuck it on the back of my hand. I held my hand up and couldn't help but admire it. It was kind of cute. But then it faded away as the magic absorbed into my skin. My hearing came back in a flood of sounds. Funny how I hadn't noticed the little noises before. The hum of the cold storage locker, the slight click of an overhead light on the verge of failing. But mostly, I heard Richard's screams of pain. I rubbed my temple as I turned to see what Alex was doing to the very not dead vampire. Chapter 17. Bullets, Bad Guys, and Lessons Learned. Richard was a despicable being, even for a vamp. But that didn't make me any more comfortable with Alex's slice-and-dice torture strategy. The cuts were superficial, and he healed as fast as they were made, so there was no way they'd actually kill the guy. But I could barely watch. I like to think my moral compass wasn't completely broken. The occasional fritz, but not broken, and my compass was saying no. Ben had followed me, and now stood next to me as we watched from 10 or so feet away in horror-filled fascination. Alex could use a sword with all the skill and dexterity that his age and years of practice allowed. If the result wasn't so disturbing, it would be pretty cool to see. "We should stop him," Ben said, but he didn't move. We should, but since Alex was asking what evidence the body in cold storage had, and no permanent damage was being done, and Richard was a sociopath. Then Alex cut him again, and Richard moaned again. No. I gritted my teeth. "Enough, Alex." And Alex stopped. He kept his sword out, but took a half-step back. "You know what the society is going to do to you?" I asked Richard. He tipped his head in my direction, and his fangs slid out. A quiet hitch in Ben's breathing made me say, "Don't worry. Alex will gut him before we can twitch." I kept my gaze pinned to Richard's fanged visage as I spoke. His incisors retracted. Time for me to cook up some drama, or Alex was going to do some real damage. It would be society-sanctioned, but I didn't think Alex would be nearly as comfortable with his actions after he'd had a few minutes to calm down. Right now, he was acting in anger. At himself for underestimating Richard. At Richard for endangering my life and Ben's. Drama. I could manage just the smallest amount. It wouldn't take much at this point. Alex was pretty scary, and he was looming only a few feet away with his very large sword. I took 2 steps closer to Richard. I'll just have a look inside your head. A lot faster than Alex's method, I think. It's too bad I haven't been practicing. Poking around in someone's head really should be more scalpel than hatchet, but I shrugged. Richard's face pinched into an unpleasant mixture of fear and hatred. What little sympathy I had, I wasn't wasting on him. Lydia, for her lost child, possibly. Abby, for her lost sort of love, maybe. But I didn't have an ounce of sympathy for Richard. A threat had no value when it was clearly a bluff. So I wouldn't bluff. I got ready to trawl through the nasty pit of sludge that was likely inside this vamp's head. Practice makes perfect, and Camille had been giving me grief about my inattention to this particular area of study. I took a breath and let my gaze slide to meet his. He cringed. "Stop!" Since I hadn't done anything, that was easy enough. I crossed my arms and tried to assume a menacing expression. Clearly, Richard believed the murmurings of pain and permanent damage certain witches' subjects suffered. Since the murmurings were spot on, that was wise of him. Alex shifted his weight, disappeared his sword into the invisible sheath on his back, and clicked a button on the tiny recorder in his back pocket. It was all one fluid motion, and he cleared his throat to cover the sound of the machine he'd switched on. "Why were you trying to destroy Chalmers' body?" I wanted to know how Alex had known to bring a recorder tonight. Richard looked at him like he'd lost his mind. "Are you serious?" Alex gave him a hard-eyed stare, and I again shifted my gaze. I wasn't even certain I could probe the slimeball's mind with just a look. I'd probably have to touch him. I reached out. "Stop!" Richard shrank back. "Okay, but... Look, I had to destroy the body, because it's being stored in a funeral home run by a witch." Ben coughed. How I'd been elevated to running the place when I'd just been hired as an odds and ends gal was a mystery. Richard gave Ben a derisive look, and the picture cleared up a bit. Enhanced trumped non-magical human every time in Richard's limited worldview. "You can do some kind of witch magic and figure out who made the cuts to the tats." Richard looked at me expectantly. I stared back without comment, and he said, "Can't you?" Without even blinking, I lied. Absolutely. Some witch somewhere probably could. And damned if I wasn't going to do some studying and figure out how it was done. At some point. Not today. And not with Richard Chalmers' body. Richard's nostrils flared. "I did it. I didn't want a child to take her away from me. Is that good enough? You'll stay out of my head." "You were jealous of a child that didn't even exist?" Ben asked. When I turned to him, to tell him to shush, the words died on my lips. He was rumpled, paler than even a redhead ought to be, and he had fine lines around his mouth that I'd swear hadn't been there the day before. I'd broken him. He was a funeral director, a guy who spent his working hours comforting the bereaved. He dealt with more stress in a single day than most people did in a month, and I'd broken him in 2 days. There went my job and any chance I had of moving out of my mother's house. And that was assuming we could avoid Cornelius's wrath and keep Ben's memory intact. This entire excursion into murder-solving insanity was turning into a lose-lose scenario. Richard's lips curled. "You wouldn't understand." "I get it," Alex said. "You were the heir. You put your time in with Lydia. You basically ran her life for her, and you had a special connection." Richard narrowed his eyes. "I did." He sounded suspicious. I saw where Alex was headed and said,
"She didn't appreciate you like she should have."
Richard relaxed somewhat.
"She didn't. She would have given it everything. The business, her
Love seemed too strong a word, so I went with a more believable option.
her affection. I get it."
Richard's fangs descended, and he flashed me a nasty look.
"You have no idea. You can't understand. You're just a grubby, potion-peddling witch."
I rolled my eyes. I'd heard it before. Money-grubbing, untalented pedestrian. They could say whatever they liked. Witches had the best magic. "You have enough?" Richard gave me a confused look, but Alex said, "Yeah," and pulled the recorder out of his back pocket. He cocked an eyebrow at Richard and then clicked the stop button. Alex was frequently more trouble than he was worth, but he came through in a crisis. If he'd been half so good on normal days, we might not have broken up. Alex had a way of making things work out in the end. Not that he'd agree. The man thought he was cursed. But as glad as I was that Ben and I had someone like Alex for backup, I didn't want to rely on the talents of others. I wanted to be the talent that others relied on. That was a new revelation. And it meant taking my studies more seriously, tapping into my witchy well, and learning how to use the magical amperage that lurked in my suburban depths. The decision clicked in my brain and gave me a chill. The good kind.
Guys?"
Ben's quiet but firm voice penetrated my haze of self-realization.
"What now?"
"Ben," I sighed. There went my happy endorphin high. One deranged psychopathic killer down, but that still left a seriously pissed off Cornelius to deal with, and Ben's recent memories to save. Chapter 18. My Hero, or Forms in Triplicate. Two of Cornelius's emergency response guys, a.k.a. his enforcers, picked up Richard, but Alex insisted on delivering the taped evidence himself, with my help. Ben came along without any great discussion. After the events of the last day, it seemed natural enough that he'd complete our sleuthing threesome. That, and we all knew the confrontation with Cornelius had to come sooner or later. The closer we got to society headquarters, the closer to the speed limit Alex drove. We all knew what would happen at HQ. The removal of those pesky memories that painted a target on our community, the ones firmly trapped inside Ben's head. I was letting him down. Alex parked, but none of us got out. After a second, I said, "I win." "It wasn't the butler." Alex grunted.
"PA, butler, same difference."
Ben leaned forward between the two seats.
"But you have to consider the fact the murder wasn't related to his PA butler duties."
"Exactly," I said. "Richard was acting as Lydia's wannabe adoptive kid." Alex took the key out of the ignition, but otherwise remained in the same position.
"Whatever his motivations, he's still the guy with a butler-like job. I win."
I don't think so." I glanced at Ben. "And it's 2 against 1.
"Right."
After a pause, Alex exhaled audibly and then closed his fingers around his keys.
"I have a plan." "Thank God."
Ben fell back into his seat.
"What do I have to do?"
"Funerals," Alex said. Ben's gaze flipped between Alex and me.
Yeah? That's part of the job description, as a funeral home director." "Exactly."
Alex opened the car door.
"Stay here. I'll retrieve you if you're needed."
I wasn't about to miss this. Ben's life as he knew it was in the balance, so I chased after Alex. I caught up with him as he opened the side door of the warehouse. Any chance the society could spruce this place up a bit? Just because you guys masquerade as a bunch of ghost chasers doesn't mean you have to hide out in a shady building. He held the door for me as I slipped through ahead of him.
I'll think about it.
I'd forgotten Alex owned the warehouse that housed the society offices. You gonna share the plan, or...
I'm gonna have a conversation with Cornelius, and you are gonna smile and agree with everything I say.
A grumble gurgled in my throat, but I swallowed it. Alex gestured to the right. I vaguely remembered Cornelius's office was in a back corner, and I couldn't forget that I found him quietly terrifying.
Come on. We left Ben in the car with no AC.
I frowned at him. He's not a dog. But I marched down the hall at a good clip, mostly because I wasn't going to let one old cranky guy intimidate me, even if he did practically run the society, but also because it was hot outside. When we got to Cornelius's office, we found him behind a massive wood desk, peering in annoyance at a bunch of papers spread across the mahogany surface. He looked up with a distinctly displeased expression.
We've received custody of Richard. You're here to deliver the recording? In part?
Alex handed him the tiny cassette from the recorder.
I need a favor.
Cornelius made a fist around the tape, gave Alex a hard look, then glanced at me.
I can't imagine where this is coming from. What do you want? Just listen to my pitch. That's all?
Alex nodded.
If you listen, I think the pitch will sell itself.
Cornelius gave the paperwork on his desk a disgusted look, then clasped his hands.
All right.
And then Alex laid out a very simple, very persuasive plan. No more shady body disposals. Ben would become the society's official provider of funeral home services, working in concert with his newly hired witch employee to ensure proper burial and disposal of enhanced beings in accordance with each enhanced type's customs. Ben kept his memory, I kept my job, and the society got to legitimize and normalize one of its illegal activities. All without risk of exposure, because I was going to be there to keep an eye on the human. No pressure. Cornelius asked a few questions. Alex had all the right answers, and that was it. Turned out that Cornelius was just as much a bureaucrat as a scary enforcer guy. He and Alex had been working on pulling the society into the new century for a while, and Alex's plan for Ben fit neatly into their modernization scheme. Good thing for Ben.
We'll call him a friend of the society.
Cornelius pursed his lips.
Have him come by tomorrow to sign the paperwork.
I almost laughed, but I caught Alex's look just in time and coughed. Cornelius was serious. There was actual paperwork. I nodded earnestly. Alex grabbed my arm and hauled me out into the hall. Good thing he did, because I busted into a fit of giggles as soon as the door closed.
Shut it, Alex said. He'll hear you.
When I quieted, he picked up the pace and said,
Let's go tell Ben the news.
I just hoped my poor, frazzled boss would think it was good news. Epilogue. Best boss ever. Ben didn't fire me. How did that happen? A reasonable person might ask. It might have something to do with his new contract with the society being dependent on my continued employment, and also to do with his intact memory being dependent on his new contract with the society. And it didn't hurt that Alex had covered the entire repair bill for Ben's renovation of the prep area. Destruction caused by my magical witch grenade. Alex felt responsible because he'd underestimated Richard and failed to psychically predict that the man would show up at Kowalski's that night. Whatever. He had the cash. Ben didn't. I definitely didn't, and it made Alex feel better. So okay. But Ben said he wouldn't have fired me even if there was no society contract, even if he'd had to take out a loan to cover the repairs. He claimed he didn't blame me for the mess of magic and murder that had landed on his doorstep, and I believed him. Why? Because I'd seen into his heart. He was peppermint and hot chocolate, a quilt on a snowy Christmas day. He was comfort and warmth. Ben was a genuinely nice, truly honest man. And that was why Ben Kowalski was the best boss ever. Also, he wasn't half bad in the kissing department. The end. In Star of the Party, the second night shift witch mystery, Ben and Star's date is interrupted by a murder mystery of the magical kind. Available in audio in 2021. For new audiobook release announcements from Kate Lawley and fun extras, join her audiobook newsletter list at katelawley.com/free-audiobook. This has been Night Shift Witch by Kate Lawley, narrated by April Doty. Copyright 2017, Catherine G. Cobb. Production copyright 2021, Catherine G. Cobb.